Good evening and welcome to Embers and Pages, where we retell the world's most beautiful stories in a voice meant for rest. How are you feeling tonight? I hope the day treated you kindly. If your heart feels heavy, if you've been holding too much inside or feeling too much all at once, you're in the right place. Here we find balance, we breathe, we let stories carry us gently towards sleep. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you've returned, thank you, it means more than you know. A soft reminder, if this story brings you comfort, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who needs rest, or letting me know in the comments which classic you'd like to hear next. Your presence here is a gift. Tonight, we're entering the world of Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen's 1811 novel about two sisters who love in entirely different ways. Elinor Dashwood guards her heart with reason and restraint. Marianne Dashwood gives hers freely, fiercely, without reservation. When loss and heartbreak test them both, each must learn what the other already knows, that neither pure sense nor pure sensibility can carry us through life alone. This is a story of balance, sisterhood, and the quiet courage it takes to feel deeply without losing yourself. Before we begin, let's settle in. Dim the lights or let the darkness embrace you completely. Lower the volume until my voice is just a murmur, soft enough that you must let go of effort to hear it. Lie down in your most comfortable position. Let your body melt into the bed, into the pillows. Pull a blanket close. Close your eyes if it feels right. Breathe slowly, in and out. There's nothing you need to do but listen, and even listening can fade. Don't worry if you drift away mid-sentence, mid-scene, mid-chapter. That's exactly what should happen. This story will be here tomorrow if you want to find out what comes next. But tonight, your only task is rest. Our story begins in the green countryside of Sussex, at an estate called Norland Park, where the Dashwood family has lived for generations. But everything is about to change. Mr. Dashwood is dying, and his daughters do not yet know that their home, their security, their entire world is slipping away. Elinor, the eldest, will try to hold everyone together with quiet strength. Marianne, passionate and unguarded, will feel everything too much. And somewhere between sense and sensibility, between reason and feeling, they will both discover what it means to truly grow up. The loss of a father is a wound that never quite heals. It leaves a hollow place, a silence where there was once guidance, protection, a steady presence in the world. For the Dashwood sisters, Elinor, Marianne, and young Margaret, their father's death came too soon, as death always does. But grief, painful as it is, was not the only blow they would suffer. Mr. Henry Dashwood had been a good man, a kind father, a loving husband. He had provided for his family as best he could, within the constraints that life and law had placed upon him. But the estate of Norland Park, the grand house where his daughters had grown up, where every room held memories, every tree in the garden a childhood story, every window a view they had loved since infancy, Norland did not belong to him. Not truly, it had belonged to his uncle, and when the old gentleman died, it passed to Henry. And when Henry died, the estate passed not to his widow, not to his three beloved daughters, but to his son from a first marriage, John Dashwood. A man whose heart, some would say, had never been particularly warm. The law was clear. The law was always clear when it came to property, to inheritance, to who mattered and who did not. The estate must go to the male heir. Custom dictated it. Tradition demanded it, and so John Dashwood became master of Norland Park, and with him came his wife, Fanny. Mrs. Fanny Dashwood was a woman of strong opinions and stronger ambitions, narrow sympathies and firm resolve. She had no affection for her husband's stepmother or his three stepsisters. To her, they were inconveniences, remnants of a previous chapter that ought to be closed as quickly and quietly as possible. She did not see them as family. She saw them as people who might make claims on money that she believed rightfully belonged to her and her son. Mr. Henry Dashwood, in his final hours, had extracted a promise from his son. "Take care of your stepmother and sisters," he had said, his voice weak, his hand trembling in his son's grip. "Promise me you will see them provided for, they will have so little. Promise me, John." And John, sitting at his father's bedside, watching the light fade from his eyes, had promised. He had meant it in that moment. He truly had. He was not by nature a cruel man, but he was weak. And his wife was very, very strong. Promises made at a deathbed have a way of softening, of becoming less urgent, once the shock of loss begins to fade, and practical concerns reassert themselves. And Fanny Dashwood had no intention of allowing her husband to be generous. £3,000, she argued, was far too much. Why should they give away money that their own son might need someday? Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters had enough, didn't they? They had a small income of their own. They could live simply. They could economize. £100 a year would be quite sufficient, surely. After all, they were not used to luxury. And besides, Fanny reasoned, what good would a large sum do them? It might make them imprudent. It might make them feel entitled. Better to give them nothing at all, really, than to spoil them with excessive generosity. Better to let them learn to live within their means. It was kinder, really, in the long run. And so, bit by bit, the promise was whittled down. 3,000 became 1,000. 1,000 became 500. 500 became an occasional gift, a gesture of kindness here and there, nothing binding, nothing guaranteed. By the time the conversation ended, nothing at all had been decided, except that John and Fanny would remain at Norland, and Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters would have to leave. Soon, very soon, because Fanny wanted to redecorate. She wanted to bring in her own furniture, her own tastes, her own vision of what Norland should be. And the presence of the former Mrs. Dashwood, wandering the halls in mourning, was inconvenient. It dampened the mood. Elinor Dashwood, 19 years old, watched all of this unfold with a calm she did not feel. She was perceptive, intelligent, deeply feeling beneath her composed exterior. She saw the way her stepbrother avoided her mother's eyes. She saw the way Fanny rearranged the furniture, dismissed servants who had worked at Norland for decades, claimed rooms as her own with brisk efficiency. She saw her mother's bewilderment, her growing anger, her helplessness. She felt the injustice of it like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. But she did not rage. She did not weep, at least not where anyone could see. She held herself together because someone had to. Her mother was consumed with grief, barely able to rise from her bed some mornings, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Marianne was drowning in emotion, in passionate sorrow that poured out of her in music and tears and long, lonely walks. Little Margaret was only 13, too young to fully understand the cruelty of what was happening, but old enough to feel afraid. So Elinor became the steady one, the sensible one, the rock in the storm. She made lists. She answered letters. She spoke calmly to servants about packing. She began, quietly, methodically, to plan for a future that looked nothing like the life they had known. Marianne, on the other hand, could not hide what she felt. She was 17, and her heart was a wild, ungoverned thing, full of poetry and passion and a fierce belief that feeling deeply was the only way to live honestly. She wept openly for her father. She raged at the unfairness of it all, at the cruelty of laws that left women at the mercy of men's whims. She walked through Norland's halls as if haunted, unable to reconcile the beloved home of her childhood with this new, cold reality where she and her mother and sisters were no longer welcome, no longer wanted, no longer secure. She played the pianoforte late into the night, pouring her sorrow into music, her fingers trembling over the keys, her voice breaking as she sang old songs her father had loved. She read poetry alone in the garden, her eyes red from crying, her shawl damp with dew. She climbed the hills behind Norland and stood there, wind whipping her hair, looking out over the landscape she had known all her life, trying to memorize it, knowing she would lose it. She did not understand how Elinor could be so calm, so controlled. To Marianne, such composure seemed almost inhuman. If you loved someone, if you lost something precious, you should feel it. You should let the world see your pain. Anything less felt like a betrayal of the heart. But Elinor's pain was no less real for being hidden. She simply carried it differently. She had learned, perhaps too young, that there are times when you must be strong for others, even when your own heart is breaking. She had learned that not all suffering can be indulged, that sometimes survival requires restraint. She loved her father as deeply as Marianne did. She mourned him just as truly. But she also knew that someone had to think clearly, to plan, to protect her mother and sisters from making rash decisions born of grief and anger. And so she became the one who did not break, at least not visibly. Mrs. Dashwood, their mother, was a woman of strong feeling, much like Marianne. She was warm, generous, impulsive, quick to love and quick to anger. She adored her daughters and she had adored her husband. His death shattered her. And the coldness of her stepson and his wife only deepened the wound, adding humiliation to grief. She wanted to leave Norland immediately, to flee the place that had become a prison of sorrow and slights. But where could they go? They had no home, almost no money, no certainty at all. And that reality, harsh and unavoidable, kept her tethered to Norland even as every day there became more painful. It was Elinor who urged patience. It was Elinor who wrote letters to distant relatives, who made inquiries through friends, who searched for a cottage, something small and affordable, somewhere they could begin again with dignity intact. She did not want to leave Norland. Her heart ached at the thought of it, but she knew they could not stay. Pride alone would have been enough reason to go, but there was also the simple, painful fact that they were not wanted. And so she prepared, quietly, methodically, for the life that was coming, even though she could not yet see its shape. When word finally came of a cottage in Devonshire, offered by a distant cousin, Sir John Middleton, Mrs. Dashwood seized it like a lifeline. It was small, Sir John wrote, modest, but comfortable, and it was theirs for as long as they wished. The rent was negligible. He would be honored to have them as neighbors. It was an act of kindness that nearly brought Mrs. Dashwood to tears. Finally, someone who cared. Finally, a place to go. The preparations for departure were bittersweet. Servants wept as they said goodbye. Rooms were emptied of personal belongings, looking suddenly strange and unfamiliar. Marianne walked through the house one last time, touching the walls, the doorways, the windowsills, as if trying to press the memory of Norland into her very skin. The day they left Norland Park, the sky was grey, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The carriage waited in the drive, loaded with trunks and boxes, with the remnants of a life that had been dismantled. Marianne stood at the gate, looking back at the house, tears streaming down her face. "I will never see it again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Never." Elinor, standing beside her, felt her throat tighten, felt the burn of tears she would not allow herself to shed. But she did not cry. She took her sister's hand and squeezed it gently. "We will remember it," she said softly. "We will carry it with us. Norland will always be ours in a way. They can take the house, but they cannot take what we felt here. What we were here." Marianne shook her head, inconsolable. "It's not the same." "No," Elinor agreed quietly. "It's not." And so they rode away, toward Devonshire, toward Barton Cottage, toward a future unknown and uncertain. Elinor looked forward, her face composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind already planning, organizing, preparing. Marianne looked back, her hand pressed to the carriage window, her heart breaking with every turn of the wheels that carried them farther from home. And somewhere between sense and sensibility, between restraint and feeling, between the sister who would not cry and the sister who could not stop, both carried a grief too deep for words. Barton Cottage was not Norland. It would never be Norland, but it was theirs, and that was something. The journey to Devonshire had been long, the roads rough, the weather uncertain. By the time the carriage finally rolled to a stop in front of the small stone cottage, the sun was setting, casting everything in soft, golden light. The cottage sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by green hills and meadows, sheltered by ancient trees that whispered in the evening breeze. It was modest, certainly. The rooms were small, the ceilings low, the furniture simple and worn. There was no grand entrance hall, no sweeping staircase, no parlor large enough for a ball. But the windows let in good light. The garden, though overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, had potential. And there was a quietness to the place, a sense of peace and gentleness that Norland, in its final painful days, had entirely lacked. Mrs. Dashwood stepped out of the carriage and looked around, her eyes bright with determination despite the weariness etched into her face. "We will make it beautiful," she declared, her voice firm. "We will plant roses and lavender. We will paint the walls. We will make it home." Elinor smiled, tired but hopeful, touched by her mother's resilience. "Yes, we will." Marianne said nothing. She stood apart from the others, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill, gazing out at the unfamiliar landscape with eyes that did not see its beauty. The hills were lovely, she supposed, in their way. The sunset painted the clouds in shades of rose and gold. But it was not home, not the home she had known and loved. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Sir John Middleton, their landlord and distant cousin, arrived the very next morning with baskets of food, offers of help, and a warmth that was almost overwhelming after so many weeks of coldness and grief. He was a cheerful, robust man in his 40s, fond of hunting and company and good-natured conversation conducted at volume. He lived at Barton Park, the great house just up the road, with his wife, Lady Middleton, and their 4 young children. He was delighted to have the Dashwoods nearby, absolutely delighted. Fresh faces, new company, charming young ladies, what could be better? He insisted they must dine at Barton Park soon, very soon, tomorrow if possible. The next day at the latest. He would not take no for an answer. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Jennings, was equally enthusiastic, though in a rather different way. Mrs. Jennings was a widow, stout and merry and endlessly, shamelessly interested in everyone's business, particularly when it came to matters of the heart. Marriage, courtship, romance, these were her favorite subjects, her greatest source of entertainment. She took one look at Elinor and Marianne, assessed their youth and eligibility with a practiced eye, and immediately began speculating about which young men in the neighborhood might make suitable husbands. She meant well, of course. Her intentions were entirely kind, her heart generous, but her lack of subtlety was startling, her questions relentless. Marianne found her exhausting, intrusive, impossible to escape. Elinor found her amusing, in a resigned, patient sort of way, and tried to answer her questions with enough politeness to satisfy without revealing anything of consequence. Still, there was something comforting about Sir John's booming generosity, about Mrs. Jennings' cheerful, if tactless, meddling. It was kindness, however awkwardly expressed. It was welcome, however overwhelming. And after weeks of Fanny Dashwood's icy disdain and John Dashwood's averted eyes, kindness felt like sunlight breaking through clouds after endless rain. The days at Barton Cottage settled into a gentle, unfamiliar rhythm. There were repairs to be made, cracked plaster to be patched, loose shutters to be fastened. There were curtains to be hung, furniture to be arranged and rearranged until Mrs. Dashwood was satisfied with the flow of each room. Mrs. Dashwood threw herself into the work with surprising energy, her grief temporarily set aside in favor of practicality and determination. She chose wallpaper, debated paint colors, planted flowers in the neglected garden. She was fiercely determined to make the cottage cheerful, to create a space where her daughters could feel safe and loved, even if they could not feel wealthy or secure. Elinor, as always, managed the details that her mother's enthusiasm overlooked. She kept careful track of expenses, made lists, ensured that necessary tasks were completed without exceeding their painfully limited budget. She wrote letters to old friends, maintaining connections that might prove valuable, that might offer comfort or opportunity. She sketched plans for the garden, envisioning where vegetables might grow, where herbs could be planted. She read in the evenings by candlelight, played the pianoforte when Marianne was not using it, and tried very hard not to think about Edward Ferrars. Edward, he had visited them at Norland in the final weeks before they left. He was Fanny Dashwood's brother, which was unfortunate, because Fanny was dreadful and Edward was anything but. He was quiet, thoughtful, kind in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He lacked the polish and easy confidence that society valued in young men, but he had something Elinor prized far more. Genuine goodness, real intelligence, a capacity for deep thought and feeling. They had talked for hours, sitting in Norland's library while rain streamed down the windows, about books and art and ideas. He had made her laugh. He had listened to her, truly listened, in a way that made her feel seen and valued. And she had felt something shift in her heart, something warm and hopeful and terrifying in its intensity. But he had never spoken of love, never hinted at attachment, never asked for her hand or made any promises. And then he had left, and she had left, and now there were hundreds of miles between them and an uncertain future stretching ahead. She did not know if he would write. She did not know if he felt what she felt. She did not even know if she would see him again. And she would not allow herself to hope too much, because hope, when unmet, was a kind of suffering she could not afford. Not now, not when she needed all her strength for the practical work of survival. So she folded her feelings away, the way she folded linens, neatly and carefully, and placed them somewhere out of sight where they could not interfere with what needed to be done. Marianne, meanwhile, wandered the hills and valleys around Barton with restless, burning energy. She walked for hours every day, alone, or with Margaret trailing behind her trying to keep up. She climbed to high places where she could see for miles, where the wind was strong and the sky vast and unbroken. She collected wildflowers and pressed them between the pages of poetry books. She read beneath trees, her voice rising and falling as she recited Cowper and Scott aloud to the indifferent sheep grazing nearby. She played the pianoforte with fierce, almost desperate intensity, losing herself in music the way some people lose themselves in prayer or wine. She was waiting, though she did not quite know for what, for something to happen, for someone to appear who would understand her, for life to become interesting again, meaningful again, worth the effort of living. She could not bear the thought of settling into quiet domesticity, of becoming someone who was content with small pleasures and modest expectations, someone who counted pennies and made do and accepted limitations. She wanted passion. She wanted meaning. She wanted beauty and depth and truth. She wanted to feel alive, fully and overwhelmingly alive. And she believed, with all the fierce, unshakable certainty of 17 years, that love, when it came, would be overwhelming and unmistakable. It would not be quiet or cautious or polite. It would be a storm, a fire, a force of nature that swept everything else aside. It would be poetry made flesh, music made visible. Anything less would not be worth having. Anything less would be settling, and settling was a kind of death. The neighborhood, as it turned out, was small but not without interest. There were the Middletons, of course, generous and sociable, always ready with invitations and entertainment. There were the Palmers, who visited occasionally, Mr. Palmer perpetually irritable and sarcastic, his wife perpetually cheerful and oblivious to his rudeness. There were a few other families, polite but unremarkable, pleasant enough for an evening's conversation, but offering little depth. And then there was Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon was a particular friend of Sir John's, a man of about 35, quiet and serious and well-mannered, with an air of melancholy that clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. He had been in the East Indies for some years. Sir John explained with enthusiasm, had seen all manner of exotic places and adventures. He had only recently returned to England and settled at his estate, De Lafford, not many miles from Barton, though he seemed to spend more time at Barton Park visiting the Middletons than at his own home. He was kind, thoughtful, well-read, a good listener. He spoke quietly when he spoke at all, and there was something in his eyes, some old sorrow, some wound that had never properly healed, that made Elinor curious and gently sympathetic. When he first met Marianne one evening at Barton Park, something flickered in his expression, something surprised and aching and almost painful to witness. He watched her the way one might watch a sunset, with quiet awe and a kind of reverent, melancholy appreciation. When she sat at the pianoforte to play, he stood near the instrument, entirely still, listening with complete, absorbed attention. And when she finished, he thanked her with a sincerity that was almost painful in its gentleness, his voice low and fervent. Marianne, for her part, barely noticed him. He was old, well, not old perhaps, but certainly past 30, which to her seemed ancient, impossibly distant from her own youth. He wore flannel waistcoats, for heaven's sake. He spoke of duty and responsibility and practical matters in that quiet, measured way. He was kind, yes, undeniably kind, but kindness was not enough. She wanted fire. She wanted poetry. She wanted someone who felt things as deeply as she did, who understood that life without passion was hardly worth living. Colonel Brandon, however amiable and well-meaning, was clearly not that person. He was too old, too reserved, too settled in his melancholy dignity. Elinor, watching from across the room, saw what Marianne did not. She saw the way Colonel Brandon's gaze followed Marianne whenever she moved, whenever she spoke or laughed. She saw the way his expression softened when Marianne played, as though the music touched something deep and long buried in him. She saw the way his face darkened when Marianne dismissed him with careless politeness, when she turned her attention elsewhere without a second thought. She saw a man capable of deep feeling, even if he expressed it quietly, in ways the world might easily overlook. She felt sorry for him in a gentle, understanding way. To love someone who did not see you, who did not value what you offered, there was a particular loneliness in that, a particular kind of quiet suffering. But she said nothing. Marianne would not have listened anyway. And besides, Elinor had learned, perhaps too young, that the heart rarely obeys reason, no matter how sensible reason might be. The weeks passed. Autumn deepened. The cottage garden began to bloom under Mrs. Dashwood's determined care. Roses climbed the walls. Lavender filled the air with its calming scent. Mrs. Dashwood made friends with the neighbors, charming them with her warmth and openness. Margaret grew an inch taller and read every book in the cottage twice. Elinor sketched and read and managed the household with quiet, uncomplaining competence. Marianne walked and played and waited, restless and yearning, for something, anything, to break the gentle, stifling monotony of their new, small, uneventful life. And then, one October afternoon, on a hillside above Barton Cottage, while the wind blew cold and the sky threatened rain, something finally did. There are some people whose kindness is so quiet, so undemanding, that the world overlooks them entirely. Colonel Brandon was one of those people. He had returned to England after years abroad in the East Indies, carrying with him memories he never spoke of, and sorrows he kept carefully hidden behind impeccable manners and reserved courtesy. De Lafford, his estate, was a fine property, well managed and prosperous, its lands productive, its tenants content. But it felt empty to him, echoing with silence. He was a man of 35, unmarried, with no family to speak of, no one waiting for him when he returned home from riding through his fields. He spent his days managing his affairs with quiet competence, reading in his library, writing letters to men he had known in India, and visiting the Middletons at Barton Park because Sir John's boisterous cheerfulness, however exhausting, was easier to bear than the particular loneliness of an empty house. And then he met Marianne Dashwood, and everything changed. It happened at Barton Park, at one of the many dinners Sir John insisted on hosting with enthusiastic frequency. The moment Marianne walked into the room, something in Colonel Brandon shifted, cracked open, came alive after years of careful dormancy. She was young, vibrant, alive in a way that took his breath away and made the room seem suddenly brighter, fuller, more real. Her eyes were bright with intelligence and feeling. Her voice, when she spoke, had music in it, a quality that made even ordinary words sound beautiful. She moved with unconscious grace, her gestures quick and expressive, her whole being animated by some inner fire he had not seen in anyone for a very long time, perhaps not since he was young himself. She reminded him of someone he had loved once, someone he had failed to protect. The resemblance caught him off guard, painful and sweet at once, but Marianne was not that other girl. She was herself, entirely herself. And he found himself drawn to her not because she reminded him of the past, but because she embodied something he thought he had lost forever, the belief that life could be passionately, fully lived. When Sir John, with his usual lack of subtlety and irrepressible enthusiasm, asked Marianne to play the pianoforte for the company, she agreed with neither false modesty nor pride. She simply walked to the instrument, arranged her music with quick, efficient hands, and began to play. And Colonel Brandon, standing near the pianoforte where he could see her face, forgot to breathe. She played Beethoven, a sonata full of longing and turbulence and aching beauty. Her fingers moved over the keys with confidence and emotion, drawing out every note's full meaning, every phrase's deepest truth. She was not merely playing music, not merely performing a social duty. She was feeling it, living it, pouring her whole soul into the sound. Her eyes closed at moments of particular intensity. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. She was utterly absorbed, utterly present, wholly given over to the music. And Colonel Brandon, listening, felt something in his chest crack open, some long-sealed place that he had thought was closed forever, healed over with scar tissue and time. When the music ended, the room erupted in polite applause. Marianne smiled, flushed with the pleasure of performance, her eyes bright and alive, and returned to her seat. Colonel Brandon approached her, his heart pounding in a way he had not felt in years, perhaps decades. His hands were unsteady, his throat felt tight. "Miss Marianne," he said quietly, his voice lower than usual, "that was extraordinarily beautiful. I do not have words sufficient to thank you." She looked up at him, polite but already distracted, her mind already moving elsewhere, her attention already turning back to her sister. "You are very kind, Colonel Brandon." And that was all. She turned away, drawn into conversation with Elinor about something that interested her more, and Colonel Brandon was left standing there alone, holding feelings he had no right to express, no reasonable expectation of being allowed to feel. He did not expect her to return his regard. How could she? She was 17, full of life and hope and romantic ideals, everything still possible before her. He was 35, marked by experience and loss, and the kind of sadness that becomes part of your face, your posture, your very manner of being in the world. His youth was long behind him. He knew he had nothing to offer her that would capture her imagination, nothing that would make her heart quicken the way music did, the way poetry did. No grand gestures, no eloquent declarations, no fire to match her own. Only steadiness, devotion, a heart that would cherish her for the rest of his life. But those things, he knew with painful clarity, were not what young women dreamed of. Certainly not what someone like Marianne dreamed of. Still, he could not help himself. When the Dashwoods were invited to Barton Park, he found reasons to be there. He adjusted his schedule, accepted invitations he might otherwise have declined. When conversation turned to music or literature, he listened for Marianne's voice, her opinions, the passionate way she defended the things she loved and dismissed the things she thought shallow or false. When she walked in the garden, he found himself watching from the window, unconsciously, making sure she was safe, even though she needed no protection from him or anyone. He could not help it. Loving her had become as natural, as involuntary as breathing. Elinor noticed, of course. Elinor noticed everything. Elinor saw the world with clear, perceptive eyes that missed very little. She saw the way Colonel Brandon's gaze followed Marianne across rooms, the way his expression softened when she spoke, the way his whole attention focused on her whenever she was present. She saw kindness there, and admiration, and something deeper, something that looked like longing tempered by resignation, hope held in check by painful realism. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a good man, truly good, deserving of happiness. But Marianne would never see him as anything more than an elderly neighbor, kind but irrelevant to her life, her dreams, her future. One evening, as the company gathered for tea at Barton Park, the conversation turned, as it often did in Mrs. Jennings' presence, to age and marriage and romantic prospects. Mrs. Jennings, as tactless as ever, declared that Colonel Brandon was quite an old bachelor and ought to marry soon before he was too ancient to enjoy domestic happiness. Marianne, overhearing from across the room, laughed lightly. "Colonel Brandon is certainly beyond the age of romance," she said, without cruelty but without thought, her tone genuinely amused by the very idea. "He must be at least 35, perhaps older. A man that old has surely settled into his habits. He wears flannel waistcoats. What could such a person know of passion or real feeling? He is very kind, of course, but kindness is not love." Colonel Brandon, sitting across the room pretending to read the newspaper, heard every word. His face did not change. He did not flinch, did not draw breath sharply, did not defend himself or correct her misunderstanding. He merely lowered his gaze to the printed page he was not reading and said nothing at all. But Elinor, watching from her seat by the window, saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, quickly concealed, carefully smoothed away. She felt a rush of anger at her sister, at her thoughtless words, her inability to imagine that anyone over 30 might still have a heart capable of deep, true, aching love. But she said nothing. What could she say? Marianne believed what she believed with the absolute certainty of youth. And Colonel Brandon would never ask anyone to defend him, would never expose his feelings to scrutiny or pity. Later that evening, when the party dispersed and the Dashwoods prepared to leave, Colonel Brandon approached Elinor as she stood by the door waiting for the carriage, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Your sister plays beautifully," he said quietly, as if their earlier conversation had not happened, as if he had not been wounded. "She has a rare gift. The world is better for such gifts." "She does," Elinor agreed, studying his face with gentle concern. "And she feels everything deeply, perhaps too deeply at times. She does not always consider how her words might affect others." He smiled faintly, sadly, with complete understanding and no bitterness at all. "That is not a fault, Miss Dashwood. The world needs people who feel deeply, who live with their whole hearts. It reminds the rest of us that we are still alive, that feeling is still possible." There was something in his voice, some echo of old pain, old loss, that made Elinor want to ask him what had happened to him, what sorrow he carried that made him speak as if he had learned to live without fully living. But she did not. Some griefs were too private, too deep to be shared with near strangers, no matter how sympathetic. "You are very kind, Colonel," she said instead, meaning it. "Kindness costs nothing," he replied, "and it is often all we have left to give." He bowed and turned away, and Elinor watched him go, thinking that Marianne was profoundly wrong. Age had not robbed Colonel Brandon of feeling. If anything, it had deepened it, refined it, made it richer and more generous. less concerned with being returned, more focused on the worthiness of its object than the pain of its circumstance. In the days and weeks that followed, Colonel Brandon continued to visit Barton Park, continued to find himself in Marianne's presence, continued to listen to her music and her laughter with quiet, aching attention. He asked nothing of her, he expected nothing. He made no demands, dropped no hints, pressed no suit. He simply allowed himself the small, bittersweet pleasure of being near her, of watching her live with the kind of unguarded joy and passionate engagement he had lost years ago and knew he would never recover. Marianne, for her part, remained oblivious to all of it. She was polite to Colonel Brandon, the way one is polite to all well-meaning acquaintances who do not particularly interest you. She thanked him when he offered to lend her books from his extensive library at Delaford, and she accepted his compliments on her playing with gracious, distracted indifference. But she did not see him. Not really. He was simply there, part of the background of her life, as unremarkable and unexciting as the furniture. Mrs. Jennings, however, saw everything. She saw the way Colonel Brandon looked at Marianne with those sad, devoted eyes, and she was absolutely delighted. A romance, how perfect! She began to hint and tease, loudly and frequently, about the Colonel's intentions. Surely he would propose soon. Surely Marianne must have noticed his admiration. What a fine match it would be, she so young and lively, he so steady and wealthy. They would balance each other beautifully. Love could grow from respect and companionship. She had seen it happen many times. But Marianne only laughed at such suggestions, genuinely amused by the absurdity of the very idea. Colonel Brandon, Mrs. Jennings, you cannot be serious. He is far too old for me. And besides, I could never marry someone I did not passionately love. Marriage without passion, without overwhelming feeling, would be unbearable. I would rather die unmarried. Mrs. Jennings clucked her tongue, unconvinced. Passion fades, my dear girl. Kindness lasts, respect lasts. You will learn that in time. But Marianne shook her head, utterly unconvinced. At 17, she could not imagine a future where passion faded, where kindness might matter more than fire. She could not imagine growing old, growing weary, needing steadiness more than excitement. Youth cannot see beyond itself, cannot imagine becoming anything other than what it is. And so Colonel Brandon loved her quietly, hopelessly, without expectation or demand. He knew she would never choose him. He knew he was not the hero of her story, not the figure of her dreams. But he could not seem to stop his heart from choosing her anyway, and perhaps, in some small, secret part of himself, he did not want to stop. Love, even unreturned, was better than the numbness he had lived with for so long. It hurt, yes, it ached in the quiet hours, but it also reminded him that he was still capable of feeling, still capable of hoping, still fully human. And that, in its own painful, bittersweet way, was a kind of grace. It happened on an ordinary morning that would become, in Marianne's memory, the most extraordinary day of her life. She had risen early, restless and eager for air and movement, and escape from the confines of domestic routine. The cottage felt too small, too confining, the walls pressing in. Her mother and sisters were still sleeping, the house quiet and still. She wanted hills, wind, the wild openness of the moors above Barton. She wanted to feel something, to escape the gentle monotony that had settled over their new life like dust over furniture. She dressed quickly, threw a shawl over her shoulders, and slipped out into the gray morning light without telling anyone where she was going. The sky threatened rain. Clouds hung low and heavy, dark with the promise of storms. The wind blew cold from the north, carrying with it the scent of coming autumn tempests, but Marianne did not care. She loved weather like this, dramatic, urgent, full of feeling and force. She climbed the steep path that led up through the hills behind the cottage, her skirts catching on brambles, her hair coming loose from its pins and streaming behind her, her breath coming quick and sharp in her chest. The higher she climbed, the stronger the wind blew, and the more alive she felt, the more herself. At the top of the ridge, she paused, breathless, looking out over the valley spread below. Barton Cottage was a tiny speck of stone and smoke far below. Fields and meadows stretched away toward distant hills. The world spread out before her in shades of green and gray and gold, beautiful and vast and wild, and for this moment it felt like hers, like it belonged to her alone. And then the rain came, not gently, not with warning, but all at once, as if the sky had simply torn open and poured itself out. Cold, heavy drops that soaked through her thin shawl in seconds, that plastered her dress to her body, that ran down her face and neck. She laughed, threw her arms wide, tilted her face to the sky, and let the rain fall on her skin. She felt wild, free, gloriously, dangerously alive in a way she had not felt since leaving Norland. She should have gone back. She knew she should have gone back. It was foolish to be out in weather like this, alone, far from shelter. Elinor would have scolded her. Her mother would have worried. But instead she ran, racing the storm, surrendering to impulse and exhilaration, her feet slipping on wet grass, her heart pounding with the sheer, reckless joy of speed and freedom, and feeling something, anything, other than quiet resignation. She ran down the far side of the hill, toward a path she had not yet explored, faster and faster, giddy and breathless and utterly heedless of danger. And then she fell. Her foot caught on a hidden root, tangled in wet grass and mud. She pitched forward violently, unable to catch herself, and felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through her ankle as she hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. The rain poured down, relentless and cold. She tried to stand, gasped at the bolt of agony that lanced up her leg, and collapsed again, her ankle screaming in protest, unable to bear her weight. For a moment, she simply sat there in the mud and rain, stunned and breathless, and suddenly, terribly aware of how foolish she had been, how utterly reckless. She was alone, far from the cottage, injured and soaked through, and no one knew where she was. No one would think to look for her until hours had passed. She felt a flutter of real fear, quickly suppressed. She would not panic. She would find a way back somehow, even if she had to crawl. And then she heard the sound of hoofbeats, rapid and urgent, drumming against the earth, coming toward her through the curtain of rain. A man appeared on horseback, riding hard down the hill with the kind of reckless speed that matched her own abandoned running. He was young, tall, dressed in a riding coat that was already drenched and clinging to his shoulders. He pulled his horse to a sharp, expert halt beside her, swung down from the saddle with athletic grace, and knelt at her side in one fluid, immediate motion, his whole attention focused on her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent but calm and steady, his eyes dark and intense and arrestingly, almost impossibly handsome, searching her face with genuine concern that seemed to see nothing else in the world but her well-being. Marianne stared at him, struck momentarily speechless by more than pain. He was beautiful. There was no other word for it, no lesser description that would suffice. His face was all elegant lines and strong, well-defined features, his dark hair wet and curling at his collar, his expression one of immediate, focused attention and concern. He looked exactly like the hero of a novel, like someone stepped out of a poem, like everything she had ever imagined and hoped for when she dreamed of what love might look like when it finally, inevitably came. "My ankle," she managed to say, her voice breathless and unsteady. "I cannot stand. I tried, but I cannot." "May I?" he asked, his voice gentle now, already reaching out with careful hands, his fingers light and cautious as he examined her injured ankle through her muddy boot. She winced as he pressed carefully, testing the damage, and he immediately gentled his touch even more. "It is not broken," he said after a moment, relief evident in his voice and face, "but badly twisted. You cannot walk on it. Not safely, not in this weather." He looked up at her, rain streaming down his face, his expression suddenly decisive and utterly confident. "Forgive my forwardness, but you cannot stay here in the rain. You will catch your death, and I would never forgive myself. Will you allow me to carry you home? Tell me where you live, and I will take you there." Marianne's heart fluttered, skipped, raced in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with pain or cold or fear. Yes, thank you. I live at Barton Cottage, just beyond the valley." He smiled then, a smile of such warmth and natural charm and unaffected kindness that it seemed to make the rain less cold, the pain less sharp, the whole world suddenly brighter and more welcoming. "My name is Willoughby, John Willoughby. I am staying at Elenham just beyond the next rise. My cousin Mrs. Smith owns the estate there." "Marianne Dashwood," she said breathlessly, unable to look away from his face. "Barton Cottage. Then Barton it is, Miss Dashwood." He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her with such easy strength that she felt weightless, as if she were no burden at all. She gasped, startled and thrilled, her hands instinctively gripping his wet coat for balance, her face suddenly very close to his. He smelled of rain and leather and horse and something else, something indefinably masculine and intoxicating and utterly thrilling. He settled her more securely against his chest, his hold confident and protective, and began to walk down the hill with long, steady strides that barely jarred her injured ankle, carrying her as if she were something precious and fragile, as if rescuing damsels in distress were the most natural thing in the world for him. Marianne, nestled against his chest, her head resting against his shoulder, felt something in her chest ignite and catch fire, something fierce and overwhelming and absolutely, unquestionably certain. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for all her life, without quite knowing what she was waiting for. This man, appearing out of the rain and wind like something summoned by her own desperate longing for meaning and passion, carrying her home in his arms, handsome and kind and brave, and exactly what she had imagined love would look like when it finally, inevitably came. They spoke as he carried her, and their words tumbled over each other with the easy, eager flow of people who have been waiting to meet all their lives and recognize each other immediately. He asked about her family, her life, how she came to be at Barton. She told him about Norland, about their loss, about the cottage and their new, reduced circumstances. He listened as if every word mattered, as if her story was the most fascinating thing he had ever heard. He told her about Elenham, the great estate he was set to inherit from his cousin Mrs. Smith, a beautiful old house full of history that he loved more than anywhere else in the world. She told him about her love of music, of poetry, of landscapes and beauty and feeling things deeply. He quoted Cowper, her very favorite poet, lines she had read 100 times. She quoted them back to him, and he laughed with genuine, delighted surprise and pleasure, as if finding someone who knew and loved the same poetry was a rare and wonderful gift. By the time they reached Barton Cottage, they were discussing books and art and music, and a dozen other subjects with the kind of passionate agreement and perfect harmony that felt, to Marianne, like discovering she could speak a long-lost language she had always known but never had anyone to speak it with. He thought what she thought, he felt what she felt, he valued what she valued. It was miraculous, it was destiny, it was meant to be. Mrs. Dashwood, hearing unusual sounds outside, rushed to the door and nearly fainted at the sight of her daughter being carried in the arms of a strange, soaking wet gentleman. But Willoughby was all charm and perfect courtesy, and immediate, sincere courtesy. He explained what had happened, apologized profusely for the intrusion and the irregularity of the situation, insisted on sending immediately for a doctor despite Mrs. Dashwood's assurances that it was unnecessary. He was attentive, concerned, respectful, exactly the sort of young man any mother would be delighted to see taking such obvious interest in her daughter. Elinor, watching from the parlor doorway with careful, assessing eyes, felt a shadow of unease even as she acknowledged his obvious charm and apparent kindness. There was something almost too easy about him, too immediately perfect, too smoothly assured. But she dismissed the thought almost as soon as it formed. She was being overly cautious, overly suspicious, letting her natural reserve make her judge too harshly. Marianne was glowing, happier than Elinor had seen her since before their father's death, perhaps happier than Elinor had ever seen her. How could that possibly be wrong? Willoughby did not stay long. Propriety and good sense demanded he leave once he had ensured Marianne was safely settled indoors with her ankle wrapped and elevated and tended to. But before he left, he bowed low over her hand and said, with warmth and obvious sincerity, "I hope you will permit me to call tomorrow, Miss Dashwood, to see how you are recovering. I will be anxious until I know you are well." "Please do," Marianne said, her eyes bright and shining, her voice breathless with hope and happiness. "Please." He smiled, that devastating, beautiful smile, and was gone, striding back out into the rain toward his waiting horse. Marianne lay on the sofa, her ankle throbbing dully but her heart soaring, flying, incandescent with joy. She turned to her mother and Elinor with eyes that shone like stars. "Wasn't he wonderful?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Wasn't he absolutely, perfectly wonderful?" Mrs. Dashwood, ever romantic, ever ready to see the best in people and situations, squeezed her daughter's hand with warm enthusiasm. "He certainly seemed very amiable, my dear. And very handsome, quite remarkably handsome." Elinor said nothing for a moment. Then she smiled gently and agreed that he seemed pleasant and well-mannered, but something in her chest remained cautious, uncertain, unwilling to surrender to hope so quickly. Marianne was so impulsive, so quick to feel everything fully and immediately. What if this young man, however charming and handsome, was not everything he seemed? What if Marianne's eager heart was leading her into disappointment? But Marianne was not thinking about caution or uncertainty or the possibility of disappointment. She was thinking about dark eyes and rain-wet hair and a warm smile that had seemed to light up the storm. She was thinking about the feeling of being carried through the rain by someone who had appeared exactly when she needed him, exactly as she had always dreamed someone would. She was thinking that life, which had seemed so dull and disappointing and meaningless since leaving Norland, had suddenly, miraculously, become interesting again, become beautiful again, become worth living. She was thinking that she had fallen in love, absolutely, completely, irrevocably in love at first sight. And nothing, she was utterly certain, nothing in the world could ever change that. Willoughby came the next day, just as he had promised. And the day after that, and the day after that. He came every day, sometimes twice a day, bringing books Marianne had mentioned wanting to read, wildflowers he had picked on his morning rides, sheet music he thought she would enjoy, his easy conversation and ever warmer smile. While Marianne's ankle healed, preventing her from walking far, he sat beside her for hours, reading aloud from their favorite poets, discussing music and philosophy and art with the kind of passionate, engaged attention that made her feel truly seen and understood for the first time in her life. And when her ankle was better, when she could walk again without pain, he took her driving in his curricle through the countryside, just the two of them racing along country lanes, with only young Margaret sometimes as their chaperone, not nearly enough supervision for propriety's sake. But Mrs. Dashwood was so pleased to see her daughter happy again, and Elinor did not have the heart to object too strenuously when Marianne's joy was so evident. They were inseparable, utterly and completely. They finished each other's sentences. They quoted the same poets without prompting. They admired the same landscapes, dismissed the same books as inferior, shared the same opinions on nearly everything. They seemed to share one mind, one heart, one soul. At least that is how it appeared to Marianne, and perhaps to Willoughby as well, though with him it was harder to tell what was genuine feeling and what was skillful performance. Marianne had never been happier. She glowed with it, radiated with it, was transformed by it. She played the pianoforte for hours every evening, music pouring out of her with renewed passion and joy and creative energy. She laughed more easily. She spoke with animation about everything and nothing. She walked through the cottage humming, smiling at nothing, lost in her own private world of happiness. She was, in every way, transformed by love, lit from within like a lantern in a dark room. Elinor watched it all with growing concern, not because Willoughby was unkind to Marianne, he was not. Not because he neglected her, quite the opposite, he was almost oppressively attentive. But because there was something about the intensity of it all, the speed and absolute certainty of it, that felt dangerous, unstable, too good to be true. They had known each other mere weeks, and already Marianne spoke of him as if they had been bound together for years, for lifetimes. Already she made plans that seemed to assume a future together, though Willoughby had never formally declared himself, never spoken to Mrs. Dashwood about his intentions, never made any promises that were explicit or binding in any legal or social sense. "Do you know his circumstances?" Elinor asked her mother one evening when Marianne and Willoughby had gone walking in the garden and were safely out of earshot. "His income, his prospects, whether he is free to marry as he chooses, or whether he has obligations, debts, entanglements." Mrs. Dashwood waved a hand dismissively, unconcerned. "He will inherit a Lenham from his cousin Mrs. Smith. That much is perfectly clear. He has spoken of it often, and beyond that, what does it matter? They love each other. That is what truly matters. Love will find a way." "But does he love her?" Elinor pressed gently, carefully. "Has he actually said so? Has he spoken to you about his intentions toward her? Has he made any promises, any commitments?" "He does not need to say it in words," Mrs. Dashwood replied with complete, unshakable confidence. "It is obvious in everything he does. The way he looks at her, the way he attends to her every word, the way he arranges his entire life around being near her. No man behaves that way unless he is deeply, truly attached. Actions speak louder than words, do they not?" Elinor wanted to argue, wanted to point out that behavior was not the same thing as commitment, that attention was not the same thing as a proposal, that love declared only through actions could vanish just as easily as it appeared. But she held her tongue. Her mother was a romantic by nature. Marianne was a passionate romantic by conviction. And perhaps Elinor herself was simply too cautious, too unwilling to believe in the kind of overwhelming, immediate love that novels promised and life so rarely delivered. Perhaps she was wrong to worry. Perhaps everything would be fine. But still she worried. She could not help it. Willoughby, for his part, played the role of devoted lover with what seemed like consummate skill. He was attentive without being suffocating, affectionate without crossing the bounds of propriety too egregiously, charming to everyone in the family. He flattered Mrs. Dashwood with compliments on her daughter's accomplishments. He joked warmly with Margaret, treating her like a beloved younger sister. And he treated Elinor with courteous respect, perhaps sensing that she was less easily charmed than the others. He seemed, in every visible way, exactly the sort of man Marianne deserved: passionate, cultured, romantic, devoted. Except for the small, nagging details that Elinor could not quite ignore, no matter how hard she tried. He was always slightly evasive when asked direct questions about his family, his background, his situation. He mentioned debts, vaguely, in passing, as if they were trivial inconveniences rather than serious concerns that might affect his future. He spoke of Elenham as if it were already his, as if Mrs. Smith's approval and favor were certain and guaranteed, though everyone knew she was notoriously difficult to please, and had not, as far as anyone knew, promised him anything in writing or made any formal arrangements for her estate after her death. And though he spent every waking hour at Barton Cottage, he never once invited the Dashwoods to visit Elenham, never introduced Marianne to his cousin Mrs. Smith, never took any of the steps that would have signaled a formal, serious intention to marry. But Marianne noticed none of this, or if she did notice, she dismissed it as unimportant, irrelevant to what truly mattered. She was in love, and love was its own justification, its own proof, its own authority. She did not need words or promises or formal commitments. She had his presence, his attention, his apparent devotion. That was enough. That was everything. One afternoon, Willoughby took Marianne to Elenham. He had mentioned earlier that Mrs. Smith was away, visiting friends in Bath for several weeks, and the great house was empty of company. He wanted to show Marianne the place he loved most in the world, he said earnestly. The place he hoped would be theirs someday when Mrs. Smith passed and the estate became his. He wanted her to see it, to know it, to understand why he loved it so deeply. They went alone. No chaperone, no appearance of propriety. Just the two of them wandering unsupervised through the empty rooms of a grand old house. Willoughby pointing out favorite paintings and furnishings, showing her the library where he had spent his boyhood reading, the music room with its beautiful pianoforte where he imagined Marianne would someday play for him every evening. She was enchanted, completely under the spell of it all. He was attentive and tender and spoke of the future as if she were inevitably part of it, as if their life together were already decided, already real, only awaiting the formality of announcement. When Elinor learned about the visit later, Marianne told her all about it with glowing enthusiasm that evening, not realizing she had done anything even remotely improper. She felt her stomach drop with dread. "Marianne," she said carefully, trying to keep the alarm out of her voice, "you should not have gone there alone with him. If anyone knew, if any of the neighbors had seen you entering the house unchaperoned, your reputation would be seriously damaged, possibly ruined." Marianne laughed, genuinely amused by Elinor's concern. "Why on earth would I care about that? Willoughby and I are going to be married. What does it matter if we were alone for an hour or two? We will be together for the rest of our lives. But he has not asked you to marry him," Elinor pointed out as gently as she could. "Has he? Not formally, not in actual words." Marianne's smile faltered just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Not in so many words, no, but it is understood between us. We do not need formal declarations. Real love does not require such things. We know, we both know." Elinor felt a chill run down her spine, cold and foreboding. "Marianne, you cannot assume." "I am not assuming anything," Marianne snapped, suddenly defensive, her voice sharp. "You do not understand. You have never felt what I feel. You think everything must be said aloud, written down, made official and proper and respectable. But love is not like that. Real love is something you know, you feel in your bones. And I know he loves me." I know it as certainly as I know my own heart, my own name." Elinor said nothing more. What could she possibly say? Marianne would not listen. She was too deep in it, too certain, too unwilling to consider that she might be wrong, that she might be seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was truly there. The days passed. October turned to November. The weather grew colder, the days shorter and grayer. Willoughby continued to visit daily. Marianne continued to glow with happiness. And then, one morning, Colonel Brandon arrived at Barton Cottage with a deeply troubled expression and asked to speak privately with Mrs. Dashwood. Whatever he said to her during that long, quiet conversation, it left Mrs. Dashwood pale and thoughtful and visibly shaken. She did not share the substance of the conversation with her daughters, but Elinor noticed the change in her mother's demeanor immediately. The new reservation, the new wariness in the way she greeted Willoughby when he arrived that afternoon as usual. And then, the very next day, everything fell apart. Willoughby arrived in the morning, much earlier than usual, his expression strange and tense and unlike anything they had seen from him before. He asked to speak to Marianne alone. They walked in the garden together for nearly an hour. When they finally returned to the cottage, Marianne's face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Willoughby looked grim, uncomfortable, eager to leave and be gone from the scene he had created. "I must go to London," he announced to Mrs. Dashwood without preamble, his voice clipped and formal, nothing like his usual warmth and charm. "Business calls me away, urgent business that cannot be delayed. I do not know when I will be able to return to Devonshire." "London," Mrs. Dashwood said, clearly surprised and confused. "But surely it is not so urgent that you cannot delay your departure a few days, a week perhaps." "I cannot delay at all," he said flatly. "Not even a single day. I leave today, this morning in fact. I have already stayed longer than I should have." He bowed stiffly. He did not meet Marianne's desperate, tear-filled eyes. He turned and left, striding quickly to his waiting horse, mounting with quick, practiced ease, and riding away without once looking back at the cottage or the girl standing in the doorway watching him disappear. Marianne stood there frozen, watching him go, silent tears streaming down her face, her whole body rigid with the effort of not collapsing. When he finally disappeared from view around the bend in the lane, she turned mechanically and walked upstairs to her room, moving like someone in a trance. She shut the door quietly behind her, and then, a moment later, the sound of wrenching, heartbroken sobs could be heard throughout the cottage. Elinor found her sister lying on her bed, sobbing with the kind of abandoned, inconsolable grief that shakes the whole body and seems to have no end. She sat beside Marianne, stroked her tangled hair, held her shaking hand, and said nothing, because what was there to say that would not be either a lie or salt in the wound? "He is gone," Marianne whispered finally, her voice broken and raw. "He is gone, Elinor, and he did not even say goodbye properly. He did not promise to write. He did not say he loved me. He did not say anything. He just left. How could he just leave like that? Perhaps he will write once he reaches London," Elinor said gently, though she did not believe it, did not believe anything about Willoughby anymore. "Perhaps once he has settled his business, he will explain everything." But Marianne shook her head slowly, some deep, terrible part of her already knowing, already understanding what her heart refused to fully admit. Willoughby did not write. Days passed in aching silence, then weeks, and no letter came addressed to Marianne. She waited, hoped with diminishing conviction, checked the morning post every day with desperate, dwindling expectation. And slowly, terribly, she began to realize the truth she had been refusing to see. He was not coming back. Whatever she had thought existed between them, whatever love she had believed in with her whole soul, had been an illusion. Or worse, a deliberate deception. And Elinor, holding her grieving sister through endless nights of tears, felt her own heart break for Marianne's pain. She thought, silently and bitterly, "I tried to warn you." But love, when it comes too fast and burns too bright and promises too much, does not listen to warnings. It cannot. And the lesson Marianne was learning now, that passion without commitment is dangerous, that feeling without reason can destroy you, was one that could only be learned through heartbreak. It was late autumn when Edward Ferrars finally appeared at the door of Barton Cottage, and for Elinor, his arrival was a complicated mercy. The weeks following Willoughby's departure had been a season of shadows. The house was saturated with Marianne's unrestrained sorrow, the sound of her weeping, the sight of her untouched meals, the heavy silence of her withdrawal. Elinor had carried the weight of it all, playing the role of the steady, sensible sister, the one who did not break. But inside, her own heart was a quiet cavern of longing. She had tried to convince herself that her time at Norland with Edward was a beautiful, brief dream that had no place in their new, harsh reality. She had told herself that if he truly cared, he would have written. If he intended to pursue her, he would have found a way. And then there he was. He looked older, perhaps, or simply more tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was a hesitation in his movements that had not been there before. He was not a man of grand gestures or easy charm. He was quiet, somewhat awkward, and possessed of a genuine kind of goodness that made the small parlor of Barton Cottage feel suddenly warmer and more substantial. Mrs. Dashwood welcomed him with the effusive warmth of a woman who loved him not only for his own sake, but for the hope he represented for her eldest daughter. "Edward," she cried, taking both his hands. "What a wonderful surprise. We have missed you more than words can say. Norland feels like a lifetime ago, does it not? But you are here now, and that is what matters." Edward's response was polite but noticeably restrained. He seemed almost pained by the warmth of his reception. "You are very kind, Mrs. Dashwood. I have thought of you all very often." He stayed for a week, and for Elinor it was a week of exquisite torture. They walked together through the valley, the air crisp and smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. They sat by the fire in the evenings, the light of the embers casting flickering shadows on the low ceiling. They talked of books, of the music Marianne would no longer play, of the simple details of their new life. On the surface, it was exactly what Elinor had dreamed of. Edward was here, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of their displaced lives. He was attentive to her opinions, gentle in his manners, and showed a quiet interest in every detail of her day. But there was a wall between them that had not been there at Norland. It was an invisible thing, built of silences and avoided glances. He would start to say something, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity, and then he would suddenly pull back, his expression closing like a shutter. He spoke of his mother's expectations for him with a bitterness that was new, of his own lack of a profession with a sense of defeat that broke Elinor's heart. "My mother wishes me to be a man of consequence," he said one evening as they walked along the garden path. "A politician, perhaps, or a man of fashion. But I have no talent for such things, Elinor. I want a quiet life. A small parish, a few books, the company of people I respect." He had almost said love. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "There is no shame in wanting a quiet life, Edward," Elinor said gently. "In fact, I think it is a very noble thing to know what truly makes one happy." He looked at her then, and for a moment the wall seemed to vanish. "You always understand," he whispered. "You always see exactly what is in my heart." But before she could respond, before the moment could deepen into anything more, he looked away, his jaw tightening. And that was when she saw it, the ring. It was a simple gold band, set with a small lock of hair under a piece of glass. It was on his finger, a place where it could not be ignored. The hair was a light, unremarkable brown, not his own, not a family member's. It was the kind of token a man wore when he was bound to someone. Elinor felt the blood drain from her face, a coldness spreading from her chest to her fingertips. She did not ask about it. She could not. To ask would be to demand an honesty that she was not sure he was ready to give, or that she was ready to hear. She simply continued to walk, her steps measured, her voice steady as she changed the subject to the beauty of the turning leaves. The rest of his visit was a blur of controlled emotion. Marianne, through the haze of her own grief, noticed the change in Elinor. "He is so strange, Elinor," she said one night as they brushed their hair by candlelight. "He loves you, I am certain of it, but he acts as though he is a prisoner being led to the gallows. Why does he not speak? Why does he not ask for you?" "Perhaps because he is not free to ask," Elinor said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "Nonsense, if he loves you, he is free. Nothing else matters." Elinor envied her sister's simplicity, her belief that love was an all-consuming force that could sweep aside every obstacle. But Elinor knew that the world was built on more than just feeling. It was built on duty, on promises, on the expectations of families and the harsh realities of fortune. On his final morning, Edward stood by the cottage door, his hat in his hand, looking more miserable than Elinor had ever seen him. The carriage was waiting at the end of the lane to take him to the post house. "I have stayed too long," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I should not have come." "Do not say that, Edward," Elinor replied, her dignity a shield around her. "It has been a pleasure to see you. We value your friendship more than I can say." "Friendship," he repeated, the word sounding hollow and bitter in his mouth. He looked up at her then, and the raw pain in his eyes was almost unbearable. I wish many things, Elinor. But wishing does not change the truth. I must go." He took her hand then, and for a fleeting second, his grip was so tight it was almost painful. He looked as if he were about to speak, about to pour out everything that was hidden behind those dark, troubled eyes. But he said nothing. He simply bowed, turned, and walked away. Elinor stood in the doorway, watching his retreating figure until the trees at the bend of the lane swallowed him whole. She did not cry. Not then. She went back into the parlor, picked up her embroidery, and sat down to work. She stitched with a precision that was frightening, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with rhythmic, mechanical grace. She did not tell her mother about the ring. She did not tell anyone about the crushing weight of uncertainty that now lived in her chest. She simply endured. She focused on the small tasks of the day, the menus, the accounts, the soothing of Marianne's outbursts. She became a fortress of sense, while inside, her sensibility was a storm of grief she feared would eventually break her. But the most difficult part was the silence. The days stretched into weeks, and then months, and there was no letter from Edward. The hope she had tried to kill was now a ghost, haunting the quiet corners of the cottage at night. She would lie awake, listening to the wind in the trees, and wonder if she would ever see him again. She would wonder if the lock of hair in that ring was a token of a love she could never compete with, or a chain that he was simply too honorable to break. She learned in those long, gray months of winter that there is a bravery in staying still. There is a courage in silence, in choosing to carry your own burdens so that others do not have to. She looked at Marianne, who let the world see every tear, every sigh, every moment of her collapse, and she felt a strange mix of envy and pity. Marianne was free to grieve. Elinor was only free to serve. And so she sat in the window seat as the first snow began to fall, her needle moving steadily through the white linen, her heart a quiet, aching secret. She was Elinor Dashwood, the sensible sister, and the world had no idea that her sense was the only thing keeping her from drowning in a sea of feeling just as deep as her sister's. She did not know yet that the true test of her strength was still to come. She did not know that a woman named Lucy Steele was already moving toward her, a secret in her eyes and a weapon in her words. For now, there was only the cold, the silence, and the memory of a gold ring with a lock of light brown hair. The silence that followed Willoughby's departure was not a peaceful thing. It was an active, heavy weight that settled over Barton Cottage, pressing the air from the rooms and the light from the windows. For Marianne, it was a silence that screamed. In the first few days, she was a whirlwind of unrestrained agony. She would not eat, she would not sleep, she would not even sit still for more than a few moments. She spent her hours pacing the small parlor until her feet ached, or wandering out onto the hills despite the biting wind and the gray, leaden sky. She looked for him in every shadow, listened for the sound of his horse's hooves in every gust of wind. She was a living vessel of feeling, and because that feeling had been so joyously full, its sudden emptying left her hollowed out and raw. "How can the world go on?" she cried one evening, standing by the window as the first stars began to pierce the twilight. "How can the birds sing and the sun rise when everything that made life beautiful has vanished? It is a mockery, Elinor. It is a cruel, heartless mockery." Elinor, sitting nearby with her needlework, did not look up. She kept her hands steady, though her own heart was a bruised and weary thing. "The world does not stop for us, Marianne. That is a mercy, not a mockery. If everything ceased when we were in pain, there would be no hope of renewal." "Renewal," Marianne laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I do not want renewal. I want him. I want the truth. Why did he leave? What business could be so urgent that it required him to break his word? He promised me, Elinor. Not in a legal contract, perhaps, but in every look, every touch, every shared breath. He promised me his life, and now he is gone, and I am left with nothing but this. This terrible, suffocating silence." Mrs. Dashwood was equally devastated, though her grief was focused on her daughter's suffering. She tried everything to comfort Marianne, sweet treats she used to love, books they had meant to read together, gentle words of hope. But everything she offered was met with a listless rejection. Mrs. Dashwood began to look older, the spark of her natural optimism dimmed by the reality of her daughter's collapse. She spent her evenings in the corner of the parlor, her eyes red from her own quiet weeping, watching Marianne with a helpless, desperate love. Elinor became the axis upon which the household turned. She was the one who spoke to the servants with a calm voice, who managed the increasingly tight accounts, who ensured that Margaret continued her studies even in the midst of the emotional wreckage. She was the one who sat with Marianne through the long, dark hours of the night when the nightmares came. She would hold her sister's shaking hand, wipe the cold sweat from her brow, and listen to the broken, nonsensical whispers of a heart in total rebellion. The neighbors at Barton Park were not helpful in their kindness. Sir John Middleton, with his usual lack of perception, believed that what Marianne needed was cheering up. He would arrive at the cottage with baskets of game and loud invitations to dinner parties, convinced that a good meal and a bit of music would cure any heartache. "She's just a bit down in the mouth, poor girl," he would boom to Elinor by the door. "Bring her up to the park tonight. We'll have a bit of a dance, some hot punch. It'll put the roses back in her cheeks in no time. Can't have a pretty girl like that wasting away over a bit of a disappointment." Elinor would thank him politely, her patience strained to the breaking point. "She is not well, Sir John. It is more than a disappointment. It is a profound shock to her system. Rest and quiet are her only medicines right now." Mrs. Jennings was even more difficult to manage. She was convinced she knew exactly what had happened, that Willoughby had been called away by a rich aunt to confirm his inheritance, and that he would return any day to claim his bride. She would sit in her large armchair at the park and weave elaborate fantasies about their wedding, about the fine dresses Marianne would wear, about the grand life they would lead at Alenham. "Mind my words," she would say, tapping her fan against her palm. "He's a good lad, that Willoughby, a bit reckless perhaps, but his heart is in the right place. He'll be back before the first frost, you see if he isn't. And then we'll have a wedding that will set the whole county talking." Hearing these words was like salt in Marianne's wounds. She would flee the room whenever Mrs. Jennings appeared, unable to bear the weight of such blind, unearned optimism. The weeks turned into a month, and the first frost did indeed come, but Willoughby did not. The letters Marianne wrote, stacks of them, filled with her soul's most desperate pleading, remained unanswered. Every morning she would wait at the gate for the post, her face pale and hopeful, and every morning she would return to the house with a silence that grew heavier and darker with each passing day. It was during this time that Elinor's own strength was tested in a way that no one else could see. While she was comforting Marianne, she was also mourning Edward. His visit, the mystery of the ring, the wall between them, it all felt like a second, quieter tragedy unfolding in the background. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, watching the embers fade to grey ash, and wonder if she was a fool to keep hope alive. Was Edward like Willoughby? Was his silence a form of rejection, or was it a form of protection? She had no one to talk to. She could not burden her mother, who was already at her limit. She certainly could not talk to Marianne, who believed that Elinor's sense meant she didn't feel at all. "You are so cold, Elinor," Marianne had shouted one afternoon after Elinor had suggested she try to eat a little soup. "You sit there with your stitching and your calm face, and you have no idea what it is to truly suffer. You talk of patience and resignation because you have nothing to resign. Your heart is a tidy little clock that never misses a beat." The words had stung more than Elinor cared to admit. She had wanted to shout back, to tell Marianne about the ring, about the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, about the physical ache in her chest that never went away. But she didn't. She simply set the soup bowl down and walked out of the room. The winter deepened. The landscape around Barton became a study in monochrome, white snow, gray skies, black trees. The isolation of the cottage became almost absolute. The visits to Barton Park became fewer as the roads grew treacherous, and the three Dashwood women were left to themselves. In the quiet of those winter evenings, Marianne began to change. The wild, explosive grief of the first weeks was replaced by a hollow, listless despair. She stopped pacing. She stopped crying. She simply sat. She would sit in the window seat for hours, her hands idle in her lap, staring out at the frozen world with eyes that were terrifyingly empty. She was like a bird that had beaten its wings against the bars of its cage until it no longer had the strength to fly or even to want to. Elinor watched this transition with more fear than she had felt for the initial outbursts. Passionate grief she understood, even if she handled it differently. But this numbness was like a kind of death. She began to fear for Marianne's health and even for her life. "We must find a way to reach her," Mrs. Dashwood whispered to Elinor one night as they sat together in the kitchen. "If she continues like this, she will waste away. She is already so thin, Elinor. Her hands are like porcelain." "I know, Mother," Elinor said, her voice heavy with her own weariness. "But we cannot force her to feel hope. We can only be here when the hope finally finds its way back to her." They did not know then that hope would not be what found its way to Barton Cottage. Instead, it was a piece of news that would shatter the fragile peace they had managed to build. Colonel Brandon visited one afternoon, having ridden through the snow from Delaford. He looked grave, his usual melancholy deepened by a new, sharp kind of sorrow. He asked to speak to Elinor alone in the parlor. "I have heard news from London," he said, his voice low. "News of Mr. Willoughby." Elinor's heart skipped a beat. Is he coming back?" The colonel shook his head slowly. "No, Miss Dashwood, he is not. He is to be married to a Miss Sophia Grey, a young lady of £50,000. The room seemed to grow colder as the words sank in. £50,000, the price of a heart. "Does Marianne know?" the colonel asked, his eyes full of a desperate, grieving kind of love for the girl in the next room. "Not yet," Elinor said, her voice trembling for the first time in months. "But she will have to know. We cannot keep this from her." "I am sorry," the colonel said. "I truly wished I could have brought better news. I would give everything I own to see her smile again." He left shortly after, and Elinor was left with the task of breaking her sister's heart one final time. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, the news of Willoughby's betrayal a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at the door to the parlor, where Marianne was sitting in her usual silence, and she felt a sudden, fierce anger at the world, at men who made promises they had no intention of keeping, at fortunes that were worth more than souls. She opened the door. Marianne did not look up. "Marianne," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, "I have something to tell you about Willoughby." Marianne turned her head then, a tiny spark of light appearing in her hollow eyes. And Elinor, the sensible sister, the one who didn't feel, the one whose heart was a tidy little clock, took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the blow that would either kill her sister's spirit or finally, painfully, set her free. The silence that followed the telling was the loudest thing Elinor had ever heard. It was the sound of a world ending. It was the sound of sense finally, tragically, meeting sensibility at the very edge of the abyss. Winter was far from over, and the hardest days were yet to come. But as Elinor held her sister's shaking, silent form, she knew that they would somehow, eventually, walk through it together, because that is what sisters do. They carry the silence until the music finds its way back. The news of Willoughby's engagement to Miss Grey was a blow that seemed to finalize the grey, wintry isolation of Barton Cottage. But life, in its relentless and often cruel complexity, was not finished with the Dashwood sisters. It was during a visit to Barton Park, orchestrated by Sir John Middleton in a desperate attempt to revive the lady's spirits, that Elinor encountered the source of her next, and perhaps deepest, trial. Sir John had invited a pair of distant relatives to stay for a few weeks, Anne and Lucy Steele. Elinor had seen many young women in her short life, but she had never met anyone quite like Lucy Steele. She was pretty enough in a small-featured, sharp-eyed way, but there was an air of calculation about her that Elinor noticed almost immediately. She was excessively polite, her voice a sugary, sweet murmur, her eyes constantly scanning the room for any advantage, any weakness she might exploit. Her elder sister, Anne, was less clever, a talkative and somewhat silly woman who seemed to exist primarily to provide Lucy with opportunities to look superior. From their first meeting, Lucy seemed determined to single Elinor out. She would sit beside her during dinner, her shoulder brushing Elinor's, her voice lowered as if they were already the closest of friends sharing deep, intimate secrets. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," Lucy whispered one evening as the gentlemen sat over their port in the next room. "I have heard so much about your goodness, your wonderful sense. I feel as though I can trust you with anything. You are so steady." Elinor managed a polite smile, though every instinct told her to pull away. "You are very kind, Miss Steele, but I assure you I am quite ordinary." "Not ordinary at all," Lucy insisted, her eyes narrowing as she studied Elinor's face. "Edward has spoken of you so often. He said you were the most intelligent woman he had ever met." At the mention of Edward's name, Elinor felt the familiar, sharp intake of breath she could never quite control. She kept her face neutral, her hands steady on her embroidery hoop. "Mr. Ferrars is a very kind man. He is a friend of our family, of course." "A friend," Lucy repeated, a strange, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Yes, I suppose he is. But I have a secret, Miss Dashwood. A secret so great it almost burns to keep it inside. And I feel that you are the only one who can truly understand it." The parlor of Barton Park was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, but Elinor felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She did not want to hear Lucy's secret. She wanted to stand up, walk across the room, and hide herself in the shadows of the hallway. But her sense, that relentless guardian of her dignity, kept her in her seat. "I am not sure I am the right person for such a confidence, Miss Steele," Elinor said, her voice cool and professional. "Oh, but you are." Lucy leaned closer, her perfume a heavy, suffocating scent of jasmine. "You see, Miss Dashwood, I am engaged to Mr. Edward Ferrars." The world did not stop. The servants continued to clear the tea things. Sir John's laughter echoed from the dining room. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady, rhythmic tick. But for Elinor, everything changed in that single, devastating second. "Engaged," she repeated, the words sounding like a foreign language. "Yes," Lucy said, her eyes bright with a hungry kind of triumph. "For 4 years now. Since before he ever went to Oxford. It was a secret, you understand. His mother, well, Mrs. Ferrars is a proud, difficult woman. She would never approve of a match with someone of my humble station. But Edward, dear, devoted Edward, he has promised that he will marry me no matter what. He says his honor is bound to mine." Elinor felt a physical pain in her chest, a tightening that made it difficult to draw breath. She looked at Lucy, at the pretty, calculating face, at the small, sharp teeth revealed by her triumphant smile, and she realized with a terrible clarity that this was why Edward had been so silent. This was the source of the ring, the shadow in his eyes, the wall he had built between them at Barton. He was bound, not by love. She could not believe, looking at Lucy, that Edward truly loved this woman, but by honor. For a man like Edward, honor was the only thing that mattered, and a promise made at 20 was a debt he would pay for the rest of his life. "I see," Elinor said. Her voice was a miracle of composure. It was steady, polite, almost entirely normal. "I had no idea. You must be very happy, Miss Steele." Lucy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, clearly disappointed by the lack of tears or outbursts. "Oh, I am. But it is so difficult, you see, to be so far apart, to have such a powerful enemy in his mother. I wanted to tell you because you are his friend, and I wanted you to know that he belongs to me, that his heart is already spoken for." The cruelty of the words was not lost on Elinor. She realized that Lucy knew. She realized that this entire confidence was not a confession, but a warning, a territorial marking. Lucy had seen the connection between Elinor and Edward at Norland, or perhaps Edward had spoken of her with a warmth that had tipped Lucy off. Either way, this was Lucy's way of saying, "He is mine. Stay away." "I appreciate your trust," Elinor said, setting her embroidery aside with slow, deliberate movements. "You may be assured that your secret is safe with me. I have no desire to interfere in Mr. Ferrars' arrangements." She stood up then, her dignity a cold, hard armor around her. She made her excuses, spoke politely to Sir John and Lady Middleton, and walked out of the room with a steady gait. But once she was outside, in the cold, dark air of the night, she felt the full weight of the blow. She did not walk towards the cottage. She walked toward the edge of the woods, where the shadows were deepest and the silence was absolute. She leaned against a tree, her forehead resting against the rough bark, and she breathed. The air was like ice in her lungs, sharp and grounding. She did not cry. She could not. The pain was too deep for tears, too monumental for the simple release of weeping. It was a structural collapse. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had believed about her future was gone. She had lost Edward. Not to death, not to distance, but to a promise he didn't want to keep. She thought of his face at the gate of Barton Cottage. She thought of the way his hand had gripped hers, the raw, unspoken longing in his eyes. And she realized that he was suffering every bit as much as she was. He was a prisoner of his own integrity, bound to a woman who delighted in the power she held over him. But Elinor did not have the luxury of her own grief. She had to go back to the cottage. She had to sit across from her mother and Marianne and pretend that nothing had changed. She had to listen to Marianne's rants about Willoughby, her mother's worries about the future, and she had to be the sensible one. The rock, the fortress. She walked back to the cottage, her footsteps silent on the frozen grass. When she entered the parlor, her mother looked up from her book with a gentle smile. "Did you have a pleasant evening, Elinor?" "Were the Steele girls entertaining? They are very talkative," Elinor said, her voice perfectly level. "Miss Lucy is a very determined young woman." "I thought as much," Mrs. Dashwood said. "She seems a bit much for my taste, but Sir John seems to like them. Come, sit by the fire. You look a bit pale, dear. The night air must be very sharp." Elinor sat. She took up her book. She even turned the pages. And inside, she began the long, agonizing work of building a new life around the hole where her heart used to be. Over the next few days, Lucy continued her assault. She would find Elinor alone, corner her in the garden or the parlor, and recount endless stories of Edward's devotion, of his letters, of the plans they had made. Each story was a tiny dagger, and Elinor had to stand there and smile as they were driven into her. She learned more about Lucy in those days than she ever wanted to know. She learned of her lack of education, her obsession with status, her coldness toward those she deemed beneath her. And she learned, most painfully of all, that Lucy was perfectly aware of Elinor's feelings. "I am so glad you understand our situation," Lucy said, as they walked in the garden on their final day. "It must be so hard for someone like you, who is so sensible, to understand the kind of wild, uncontrollable love that Edward and I share. It is a burden, truly, but one we carry gladly." The irony was nearly unbearable. Sense and sensibility. Lucy was claiming the language of feeling to mask her own cold ambition, while Elinor was using every ounce of her sense to protect the very feelings Lucy was mocking. When the Steeles finally left Barton Park, the relief was so profound that Elinor felt she could almost float. But the relief was short-lived. The secret was now a permanent guest in her mind, a shadow that followed her every move. Winter was drawing to a close, but for Elinor, the spring held no promise of warmth. She was alone in her knowledge, alone in her grief, and more aware than ever that the path she was walking was a solitary one. She looked at Marianne, who was slowly beginning to emerge from her deepest depression, and she felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness. Marianne's heartbreak was public, supported by the sympathy of the world. Elinor's was private, supported only by her own willpower. "We are going to London, Elinor," Marianne said one morning, her voice finally holding a spark of its old fire. "Mrs. Jennings has invited us for the season, and I am going. I must see Willoughby, I must know the truth." Elinor looked at her sister's pale, determined face, and she knew she had to go too. She had to go to protect Marianne. And she had to go because, however much it hurt, she had to see Edward again. She had to know if he was truly lost to her. She did not know, as they packed their trunks and said goodbye to the little stone cottage in the valley, that London would hold both the highest peaks of their hopes and the darkest depths of their despair. She only knew that they were moving forward, away from the silence of Barton and toward a future that had never felt more uncertain. She was Elinor Dashwood. She was sensible, and she was ready for whatever the city had to throw at her. Even if it was the sight of Edward Ferrars standing beside Lucy Steele, his hand in hers, his promise finally, fatally kept. The carriage rolled away from the cottage, its wheels clicking against the frozen road. Elinor looked at the hills one last time, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was moving toward the storm, and she had never felt more like the steady, silent eye at its center. London was waiting. And the truth was waiting with it. The lesson of sense and sensibility was only just beginning, and the final cost of honor was yet to be paid. The journey to London was a blur of grey landscapes and the rhythmic rattling of the carriage wheels, a sound that seemed to echo the persistent throb of Marianne's hope and Elinor's dread. Mrs. Jennings, ever bubbly and oblivious to the finer shades of emotional distress, spent the miles chattering about the delights of the city, the shops, the theaters, and the inevitable flow of eligible bachelors who would be at their disposal once they arrived. Marianne sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see Willoughby's face in the passing clouds. She had convinced herself that the silence of the past few months was a logistical error, a failure of the post, or perhaps even a test of her devotion. "Once we are in the same city," she whispered to Elinor as they crossed the outskirts of London, "there will be no more excuses. He will know I am here, and he will come." Elinor, her own heart heavy with the secret of Edward's engagement to Lucy Steele, could only offer a sympathetic silence. She knew the dangers of such unfettered hope, having seen it bloom and wither in the quiet corners of Barton Cottage. She looked at the crowded streets, the soot-stained buildings, and the endless stream of carriages, and felt a profound sense of isolation. In this vast, bustling hive of activity, their small tragedies seemed both more acute and more easily overlooked. They settled into Mrs. Jennings' house in Berkeley Street, a place of heavy draperies, polished mahogany, and an atmosphere of relentless sociability. Within days, the invitations began to arrive. London in the winter season was a whirlwind of activity, and Mrs. Jennings was determined that her sweet young ladies should not miss a single moment of it. For Marianne, every knocking at the door was a possible announcement of Willoughby's arrival. She stayed near the drawing room, her ears tuned to the sound of visitors being greeted in the hallway. She wrote another letter, her hand trembling as she addressed it to the house she knew he frequented. She waited, her energy a nervous, brittle thing that seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. And then came the invitation to the ball. It was to be a grand affair, hosted by a wealthy family with connections to half the ton. Mrs. Jennings was triumphant. "Everyone who is anyone will be there," she declared, fluttering the gold-edged card. "It is the very thing to bring the color back to your cheeks, Marianne." Marianne agreed to go with a fervor that was almost frightening. She believed, with the absolute certainty of her sensibility, that this was where the resolution would happen. This was where Willoughby would see her, where the truth would be revealed, and where their interrupted romance would resume its rightful place in her life. The evening of the ball was cold and clear. Marianne dressed with a meticulous care that Elinor found heartbreaking. She chose a gown of pale silk, white as a winter morning, and arranged her dark curls with a simplicity that emphasized her fragile beauty. She looked like a girl stepping into a dream, or perhaps a sacrifice being led to the altar. The ballroom was a sea of glittering light, the heat from hundreds of wax candles pressing against the chilled air. The music of the orchestra swirled through the room, competing with the hum of 100 conversations and the rhythmic rustle of silk. Marianne stood near the entrance, her hand gripping Elinor's arm with a strength that was painful. Her eyes scanned the room with a desperate, hungry intensity, searching every cluster of gentlemen, every group of dancers. And then she saw him. Willoughby was standing across the room, leaning against a pillar, looking exactly as he had on the hills of Barton, handsome, easy, and possessed of a devastating charm. He was talking to a group of fashionable people, laughing at something a young woman in a yellow gown had said. Marianne's breath hitched. "He is there," she whispered, her voice a mixture of terror and triumph. "Elinor, look. He is there." Before Elinor could stop her, Marianne began to cross the room. She did not navigate the crowd with the careful, measured steps of a lady in society. She moved with a directness that drew eyes and raised whispers. She was a leaf caught in a current, pulled toward the only thing that mattered. As they neared him, Willoughby turned. For a heartbeat, his expression shifted. The mask of easy charm slipped, revealing a flash of genuine shock, perhaps even a flicker of the old affection. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, practiced indifference that was more devastating than any anger could have been. "Miss Dashwood," he said, bowing with a formality that felt like a slap. "I was not aware you were in town." Marianne stopped as if she had hit an invisible wall. The color drained from her face, leaving her eyes dark and hollow. "Willoughby," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "I have written, I have waited. Why have you not come?" Willoughby glanced uncomfortably at his companions, who were now watching the scene with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. The young woman in the yellow gown, a Miss Sophia Grey, whose fortune was the talk of the season, tilted her head, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. "I have been very occupied, Miss Dashwood," Willoughby said, his voice level and devoid of any warmth. "London is a busy place. I am sure you understand that some acquaintances are. Situational. Marianne repeated the word as if it were a physical weight. Was the rain situational? Was the music? Was the promise you made in your every look? Willoughby's jaw tightened. I made no promise, Miss Dashwood. If you chose to read more into our friendship than was intended, I can only express my regret for your confusion. The cruelty of the words was absolute. It was a complete and total disavowal of everything they had shared, the long walks, the shared poetry, the secret visits to Elenham. It was a rejection not just of her heart, but of her very perception of reality. Marianne stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, her whole body shaking. The ballroom, with its glittering lights and swirling music, seemed to dissolve around her, leaving her alone in a cold, dark void. May I present my fiancée? Willoughby continued, his voice regaining its smooth, polished tone as he gestured to the woman in yellow. Miss Grey and I are to be married next month. Miss Grey gave a sharp, triumphant nod, her eyes scanning Marianne with a cool disdain. We are very busy with the arrangements, as you can imagine. A wedding of such consequence requires a great deal of attention. Elinor stepped forward then, her own pain forgotten in the face of her sister's total collapse. She took Marianne's arm, her grip steady and supportive. Come, Marianne, we are leaving. She did not look at Willoughby. She did not offer him the satisfaction of her anger. She simply guided her sister away through the crowd that was now openly whispering and pointing. They moved like ghosts through the forest of fashionable people, out into the cold night air and into the waiting carriage. The ride back to Berkeley Street was silent, save for the sound of Marianne's shallow, ragged breathing. She did not cry. She did not speak. She sat in the corner of the carriage, her face a white mask of shock. The hope that had sustained her for months had not just withered, it had been violently murdered in front of her. Once they were inside the house, Elinor led her upstairs. Marianne moved like a puppet, allowing herself to be undressed, to be tucked into bed, to be given a glass of water she did not drink. She lay in the darkness, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing. He lied, Elinor, she said finally, her voice a thin, ghost-like thread. He didn't just leave, he lied about ever having been there at all. I know, Elinor whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding her sister's cold hand. I know, Marianne. How can a person do that? How can they look at you with love in their eyes and mean nothing by it? How can they quote poetry and then talk about situational acquaintances? Elinor had no answers. She could only offer the quiet support of her presence. She sat with Marianne throughout the night, watching as the shock slowly gave way to a grief so profound it seemed to pull the very life from the air. In the days that followed, the full extent of Willoughby's betrayal became clear. A letter arrived for Marianne, a cold, legalistic document that returned her own letters and the lock of hair he had once cherished. It was written in a hand that was not his own, but it bore his signature. It was a formal termination of a relationship he claimed had never truly existed. Marianne did not pace the room this time. She did not rage. She sank into a listless, terrifying despair. She spent her days on the sofa, her face turned toward the wall, refusing food, refusing company, refusing life. The vibrant, passionate girl of Barton Cottage was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of sorrow. Elinor, meanwhile, had to navigate the social fallout. Mrs. Jennings, though genuinely sorry for Marianne, could not help but talk about the situation, repeating Willoughby's new fortune to anyone who would listen. Colonel Brandon visited daily, his face gray with a sorrow that matched the sister's own. I wish I could have spared her this, he said to Elinor one afternoon in the drawing room. I have seen this happen before, a heart like hers. It does not break gently, it shatters. Elinor looked at him and saw the truth of his own past in his eyes. He had loved someone like Marianne, someone who had been broken by a man like Willoughby. He understood the danger of a sensibility that had no sense to protect it. She will survive, Elinor said, though her voice lacked conviction. She must. But as she looked at her sister's gaunt, pale face, Elinor felt a chilling doubt. London had promised them a resolution, and it had delivered one of the cruelest kind. The city was no longer a place of possibility. It was a theater of heartbreak, where fortunes were prioritized over feelings, and honor was a currency that men like Willoughby had long ago spent. Elinor sat by the window, watching the rain wash over the soot-stained streets, and felt the weight of her own secret growing heavier. She was the one who had to be strong, the one who had to hold the pieces together while her own heart was quietly crumbling. She had to be the sense for both of them, even as the sensibility of their shared grief threatened to pull them both under. London was cold, and the winter was far from over. And for the Dashwood sisters, the hardest lessons were only just beginning to be learned. The London air began to feel heavy, as if the charcoal-laden fog had seeped through the walls of Berkeley Street and settled directly into the lungs of its inhabitants. For Marianne, the atmosphere was not just suffocating, it was toxic. The vibrant life she had brought with her from the green hills of Devonshire had been extinguished, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost deafening. She did not rage against Willoughby any longer. The time for explosive sensibility had passed. In its place was a listlessness that terrified Elinor more than any scream or tear ever could. Marianne spent her days on the drawing-room sofa, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the heavy velvet curtains. She did not read, she did not play the pianoforte. Even the poetry she had once lived by lay forgot on the side table, its pages gathering dust in the cold London light. "You must eat something, Marianne," Elinor pleaded one afternoon, holding a bowl of soup she had coaxed the cook into making. "For Mother's sake, if not for your own, she will be heartbroken if she sees you like this when we return." Marianne turned her head slowly, her eyes looking like bruised hollows in her gaunted face. "Mother will understand, Elinor. She knows that when the heart is dead, the body has no reason to continue. Why should I nourish a shell that holds nothing but shadows?" "Because you are more than your shadows, Marianne," Elinor said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "You are still her daughter. You are still my sister. We need that shell, as you call it, because we love what is inside." Marianne gave no response. She simply turned her face back to the wall, a movement so slow and tired it felt like the final settling of a tomb. It was during these dark days that Colonel Brandon became a constant presence in the house. He did not come with the boisterous optimism of Sir John or the gossiping cheer of Mrs. Jennings. He came with a quiet, steady kind of devotion that sought no acknowledgement. He sat in the drawing-room with Elinor, his face a landscape of worry and shared grief. He watched the door to the room where Marianne lay, his eyes full of a desperate, helpless love. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together in the fading light, the Colonel finally spoke. He did not talk of the weather or the news of the town. He talked of the past. "I have something to tell you, Miss Dashwood," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Something that might help you understand. The man your sister is mourning." Elinor set down her needlework, her attention focused entirely on him. "Willoughby?" "Yes." The Colonel looked at the fire, the orange light reflecting in his pained eyes. "I have stayed silent for too long, perhaps out of a desire to forget, or perhaps to protect a memory that was already broken. But I cannot see your sister waste away for the sake of a man who is unworthy of even her contempt." He told her then the story of Eliza. Not the elder Eliza whom he had loved and lost long ago, but her daughter, a girl entrusted to his care. He told Elinor how Willoughby had found her, a young and innocent girl of 15, and how he had seduced her under the guise of the very same sensibility he had used on Marianne. He told her how Willoughby had abandoned the girl when she became pregnant, leaving her in a small, damp cottage with no money and no hope, fleeing to London, and the arms of an heiress when his debts became too heavy to manage. "He is a man who consumes beauty and innocence for his own convenience," the Colonel said, his voice hard with a suppressed rage. "He has no heart of his own, Miss Dashwood. He only knows how to mimic the hearts of others until he has used them up." Elinor listened in a stunned silence. The scale of the cruelty was beyond anything she had imagined. She thought of Marianne, so open, so passionate, so trusting, and she felt a sudden, fierce anger. Willoughby had not just broken her sister's heart. He had brought his habitual poison into their lives, treating Marianne like just another situational acquaintance to be used and discarded. "Thank you for telling me, Colonel," Elinor said, her own voice brittle. I wish she had never met him." "We all wish that," the Colonel replied quietly, "but she did. And now we must help her find her way back from the edge of the pit he dug for her." Elinor carried the weight of this new knowledge back to her sister. She did not tell Marianne everything at first. She waited for a moment when Marianne seemed a little more present, a little more capable of hearing the truth. "Marianne," she said one evening, sitting on the edge of the bed, "Colonel Brandon has told me something about Willoughby's past. Something you must hear. As Elinor recounted the story of Eliza, she watched the flickers of expression on her sister's face. For the first time in weeks, there was something other than despair. There was a spark of horror, a flash of shared feminine outrage. The idea that Willoughby could be so cold, so calculatingly cruel to a child, seemed to pierce the fog of Marianne's own grief. He left her, Marianne whispered, her voice cracking. In a cottage, with nothing. Yes, while he was here dancing with Miss Grey, while he was in Devonshire quoting Cowper to you. Marianne sat up slowly, her hands gripping the sheets. Then I am not unique. I was not even a special tragedy to him. I was simply a pattern. You were a beautiful soul who fell into the path of a predator, Elinor said firmly. His betrayal of you was not a reflection of your worth, Marianne. It was a reflection of his own emptiness. This revelation did not cure Marianne, but it changed the nature of her suffering. The listless despair began to morph into a quiet, simmering resentment. She began to eat a little, to sit up for longer periods, but she was still fragile, both physically and emotionally. The London cold seemed to have settled into her bones, and she complained of a persistent, nagging chill that no amount of blankets could ease. Her condition worsened as the weeks passed. The depression had weakened her immune system, and she developed a fever that refused to break. She spent her nights tossing and turning, her whispers filled with a confusing mix of names and places: Norland, Barton, Willoughby, the rain. I need to go home, Elinor, she murmured one night, her forehead burning under Elinor's damp cloth. I can't breathe in this city. Everything is so dark and heavy. I need to see the hills. We will go home, Marianne, Elinor promised, her own exhaustion catching up with her. As soon as you are strong enough to travel. But Marianne did not seem to be getting stronger. The fever deepened, and a persistent cough began to rattle her chest. Mrs. Jennings called in the best doctors in London, but their tinctures and advice seemed to do little more than provide a temporary respite. The consensus was clear. The lady's heart had weakened her body, and the body was now struggling to defend itself. Colonel Brandon was there every day, sometimes staying late into the night. He would stand in the hallway, his presence a silent vigil. He brought specialists, he researched treatments, he did everything in his power to help. He did not ask to see her, but Elinor could feel the weight of his redirected focus. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was a silent partner in the battle for Marianne's life. During those long, terrifying nights, Elinor found herself leaning on the Colonel's quiet strength. When the doctors' faces were bleak and Mrs. Jennings was in a panic, he was the one who remained steady. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered practical help and a shared, realistic understanding of the stakes. One night, as Marianne's fever reached a peak and she drifted in and out of a delirious sleep, Elinor sat in the chair by the window, her head resting against the cold glass. She was utterly spent. The months of carrying everyone's secrets, everyone's griefs, and now her sister's life had brought her to the very edge of her endurance. She looked at the Colonel, who was sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the bed. She has to pull through, Colonel, Elinor whispered, her voice almost gone. She's too young for this to be the end of her story. She will, the Colonel said, his voice a low growl of determination. She has a fire in her, Miss Dashwood. It may be dampened right now, but it hasn't gone out. She will pull through. He moved toward the bed then, and for a fleeting second, his hand brushed against the post. His expression was one of such intense, selfless devotion that Elinor felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. It was a love that asked for nothing, a love that was content simply to stay in the shadows and protect. It was a sensibility that had survived the harshest of winters and had emerged as the purest kind of sense. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, Marianne's fever finally broke. She fell into a deep, natural sleep, her breathing becoming steadier and more regular. Elinor let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days. They were not out of danger yet. The journey to recovery would be long and difficult, and the move out of London would be a test of its own. But the immediate crisis had passed. Elinor looked at the sleeping girl on the bed, and then at the tired man in the chair, and she realized that the world was more complex than she had ever imagined. Sense wasn't just about restraint, and sensibility wasn't just about feeling. They were both necessary parts of a whole, and sometimes the most sensible thing you could do was to allow yourself to feel the full weight of the world and the most sensible people were the ones who loved you through the worst of it. London was still cold, but as the sun began to rise over the rooftops, there was a tiny, fragile promise of spring in the air. Marianne was still with them, and for now that was enough. The flight from London was not a triumph, but a retreat. As the heavy carriage pulled away from Berkeley Street, Elinor felt a profound sense of relief that was immediately swallowed by the realization that they were carrying the source of their own sorrow with them. Marianne sat in the corner, her face pale and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the passing hedgerows. She was breathing, but she was not present. The plan was to stop at Cleveland, the home of the Palmers, on their way back to Devonshire. It was an estate of grand gardens and wide, sweeping lawns, a place that should have been a sanctuary, but instead became a setting for a nightmare. Mr. Palmer, with his usual mask of cynical indifference, and Charlotte, with her relentless, bubbling cheer, welcomed them with a warmth that felt like a mockery to the sisters' internal states. "It will be so good for you, Marianne," Charlotte cried as they entered the grand hallway. "The air here is so fresh, and the gardens are simply divine. You'll be your old self in no time." Marianne managed a thin, polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. She went to her room almost immediately, pleading an exhaustion that was not a lie, but a fundamental truth of her existence. The first few days at Cleveland were a study in quiet desperation. Elinor walked the grounds, her own heart aching with the memory of Edward and the constant, nagging worry for her sister. She looked at the budding trees and the emerging flowers and felt a deep, existential weariness. The cycle of the seasons continued, oblivious to the fact that for some, the winter had never ended. Marianne, however, began to show a strange, restless energy. She would not sit in the parlor or listen to Charlotte's talk of the local gentry. Instead, she spent her hours wandering the gardens, her hair coming loose in the wind, her thin shawl offering little protection against the damp spring air. She seemed to be looking for something she knew she wouldn't find, or perhaps she was simply trying to outrun the silence of her own mind. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the first drops of a heavy rain began to fall, Marianne did not return from her walk. Elinor, standing by the window of the drawing room, felt a sudden, cold prickle of fear. "Where is Marianne?" she asked Charlotte, who was busy with her embroidery. "Oh, she's likely in the library or perhaps the greenhouse," Charlotte said, not looking up. "She's been very keen on the flowers lately." But Elinor knew her sister better. She grabbed a cloak and stepped out into the rain. The wind was whipping across the lawns, and the temperature had dropped. She called Marianne's name, her voice swallowed by the roar of the trees. She found her at the edge of the estate, standing on a ridge that looked out over the valley. Marianne was soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her fragile frame, her face tilted up toward the storm as it had been on the day she first met Willoughby. But there was no laughter this time. There was only a terrifying, vacant stillness. "Marianne," Elinor cried, reaching her side and throwing the cloak around her. "You must come inside at once." "You'll catch your death." Marianne looked at her then, and for a second her eyes were clear. "I wanted to see the rain, Elinor. I wanted to feel something that was real, something that wasn't a lie." "The rain is real, but it is also cold and dangerous," Elinor said, pulling her sister toward the house. "Please, Marianne, come with me." That night, the physical price of Marianne's sensibility became apparent. The fever that had been simmering in London returned with a vengeance. She drifted into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, her body burning while her teeth chattered with an uncontrollable chill. Her cough became a deep, racking sound that echoed through the quiet hallways of Cleveland. The Palmers, realizing the seriousness of the situation, called for the local apothecary, and then for a doctor from a nearby town. The diagnosis was grim, putrid fever, complicated by severe exhaustion and a weakened system. "She is very ill, Miss Dashwood," the doctor said, his face grave as he stood by the bed. "Her spirit seems to have no fight left. If the fever does not break by tomorrow night, I fear for the outcome." Elinor did not leave her sister's side. She sat in the chair by the window, the same vigil she had kept in London, but this time with a different, more absolute kind of terror. She bathed Marianne's forehead with vinegar and water. She whispered words of comfort that went unheeded, and she prayed with a fervor she hadn't known she possessed. Colonel Brandon arrived the next day, having ridden through the night from London when word reached him of their detour. He stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the bed, his face a silent scream of agony. He did not speak to Elinor. He simply took over the tasks that needed doing, coordinating with the doctor, managing the staff, and providing a steady, solid presence in a house that was suddenly falling apart. But it was during the middle of the following night, when the storm outside was at its height, and the silence inside was at its most suffocating, that the true crisis arrived. There was a sound of a horse galloping up to the house, and then a loud knocking at the door. Elinor, half asleep in her chair, started awake. She heard voices in the hallway, hushed and urgent. A servant appeared at the door. "Miss Dashwood, there is a gentleman below. He says he must see you at once. He says it is a matter of life or death." Elinor's first thought was of her mother, or perhaps some news of Edward. She smoothed her hair, composed her face, and went downstairs. In the dimly lit library, standing by the fireplace, was a man she never expected to see again. Willoughby. He was disheveled, his coat muddy and his hair wild. He looked like a man who had ridden through hell to get there. At the sight of him, Elinor felt a surge of anger so powerful it left her breathless. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice like a cold blade. "Have you not done enough? Have you not taken enough from this family?" Willoughby did not look at her with his usual charm. He looked broken. "I heard she was ill. I heard she was dying." "She is very ill," Elinor said, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "Information you have no right to possess. I possess it because I am a prisoner of it." Willoughby stepped forward, his eyes bright with a desperate, manic intensity. "I know what I have done, Miss Dashwood. I know the cost of my own cowardice. But I could not let her go without saying the truth. The truth," Elinor laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "The truth that you are a seducer and a liar. The truth that you traded a soul for £50,000. Yes. All of it," Willoughby cried, his voice breaking. "I am all of those things. I am a man who chose comfort over honor and fortune over love. But I loved her, Elinor, in the only way a man as hollow as I am can love anyone. I loved her at Barton, I loved her on the hills, and God help me, I love her now." He poured out a confession then, a torrent of words that explained the reality behind his actions. He told her about his debts, his fear of poverty, and the ultimatum from his cousin Mrs. Smith that had forced his hand. He told her how his engagement to Miss Grey was a transaction of necessity, a way to escape the abyss that was opening up beneath him. "I thought I could forget her," he said, his face buried in his hands. "I thought money could fill the hole she left, but every time I see my fiancé, I see the ghost of what I threw away. Every time I hear music, I hear the echo of her voice. I am in a hell of my own making, Miss Dashwood, and the worst part of it is that I deserve it." Elinor listened, her anger slowly tempering into a profound, weary pity. She saw the man before her not as a hero or a villain, but as a tragic, flawed creature who had been destroyed by his own lack of character. He was a cautionary tale of what happens when sensibility isn't just a trait, but a weakness. "What do you want, Willoughby?" she asked finally, her voice tired. "I want her to know," he whispered. "I want to think that if she dies, or if she lives, she knows that it wasn't all a lie. That there was a moment once in the rain in Devonshire when I was a better man because of her." "I will tell her," Elinor said, "but not now, and not for your sake. I will tell her because she deserves to know that her heart was not entirely wasted on a shadow." "Thank you," Willoughby said, a quiet, broken sob escaping him. He turned toward the door, his gait slow and unsteady. "I will go now. I have no place here." He walked out into the night, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing on the gravel until it was lost in the roar of the wind. Elinor stood in the silence of the library for a long time. She felt as though she had been through a second storm, one that had stripped away the last of the illusions that had haunted them since Norland. She went back upstairs to the room where Marianne lay. The fever was still there, but as Elinor looked at her sister's pale, quiet face, she felt a new kind of hope. It was a hope born not of desire, but of a hard-won clarity. Colonel Brandon was still there, his presence a silent anchor in the dark. He looked at Elinor, and the question in his eyes was clear. "He is gone," Elinor said quietly, "and he is exactly what we thought he was, but he is also more human than I realized." The colonel nodded slowly. He did not ask for details, he simply went back to his vigil. As the dawn began to break over the hills of Cleveland, the doctor entered the room. He checked Marianne's pulse, felt her forehead, and for the first time in days, a look of cautious optimism crossed his face. "The fever is breaking," he whispered. She's coming through. Elinor closed her eyes, the tears she had held back for months finally spilling over. Marianne was alive. The crisis had passed. The sun began to rise, painting the lawns of Cleveland in shades of gold and amber. The storm was over, and the earth was wet and fresh and ready for the spring. Elinor took her sister's hand, its skin finally cool to the touch. The journey was not yet finished, and there were still many truths to be faced, but for now they were alive, they were together. And the light was finally, gratefully, finding its way back. The return to Barton Cottage was a quiet, gentle homecoming, a soft landing after the jagged peaks and dark valleys of the past few months. As the carriage rolled over the familiar bridge and up the winding lane, Elinor felt a profound sense of gratitude. The hills were finally green, the trees were in full leaf, and the air was filled with the scent of a Devonshire spring, a smell of damp grass, wild primroses, and the promise of renewal. Marianne was carried into the cottage, her body still fragile but her eyes clear. She was no longer the fevered girl of Cleveland, nor the hollow ghost of London. She was a woman in recovery, both physical and emotional. She looked at the small rooms of their home, the modest furniture, the familiar books, the view of the valley from her window, and for the first time in a long time, she looked like she belonged there. Mrs. Dashwood was a whirlwind of maternal devotion. She had been terrified for her daughter's life, and the relief of having her back and essentially whole was almost more than she could carry. She spent her days hovering over Marianne with bowls of broth, warm shawls, and endless, gentle encouragement. "You are home now, my love," Mrs. Dashwood whispered as she tucked Marianne into her own bed. "Everything that happened, it is behind us now. The hills will heal you. The silence will give you back your strength." Marianne took her mother's hand. "I know, Mother, and I am sorry for everything. I have been so selfish in my grief." "Nonsense," Mrs. Dashwood cried, though her eyes were wet. "You have been in pain, and pain is not a choice. It is a weather that must be endured. And you have endured it, Marianne. You have survived the storm." The weeks that followed were a season of quiet reclamation. Marianne began to walk again, at first only to the garden gate, then slowly further into the valley. She did not run elective races with the wind anymore. She walked with a measured, appreciative pace. She spent hours in the garden, watching the transformation of the earth, her hands often resting on the open pages of a book she was finally reading again. She talked to Elinor with a new kind of honesty. There were no more outbursts of sensibility, no more declarations that Elinor didn't feel. Instead, there was a shared, quiet recognition of the toll the past year had taken on both of them. "I have been thinking about what you said at Cleveland, Elinor," Marianne said one afternoon as they sat on the bench beneath the old apple tree. "About Willoughby, and about yourself." Elinor paused in her stitching. "What about me, Marianne? About how you carried everything. My grief, mother's worry, your own secrets. I used to think your sense was a lack of feeling. I thought it was a way of staying safe, of staying small. But I see now that it was the greatest kind of courage. You stayed still so that I could fall. You were the anchor while I was the storm." Elinor felt a lump in her throat she couldn't quite swallow. "I did what I had to do, Marianne. We are sisters, that is what we are for." "But at what cost to you?" Marianne asked, her voice soft with a new perception. "You love Edward Ferrars, I know you do, and yet you never spoke of it. You never let your own heart's breaking disrupt the peace of the house. How did you do it, Elinor? How did you stay so steady when the world was falling apart?" "By remembering that the world isn't just about me," Elinor said, her voice steady but her heart finally, cautiously opening. "And by believing that if a thing is true and good, it will eventually find its way back. And if it doesn't, then it wasn't the thing that was meant for me." But the ultimate test of Elinor's sense was about to arrive. One morning, a servant brought news from the post house. A traveler, passing through on his way to Exeter, had shared a piece of gossip that was already spreading through the county. "Mr. Ferrars is married," the servant said, her eyes wide with the excitement of the news. "Married to a Miss Lucy Steele. It happened in London just a few days ago. They say it was a secret affair and that his mother is in a state of absolute fury." The news hit Elinor like a physical weight. She sat down at the table, her hands going cold. Married, it was done. The promise had been kept and the final door had been closed. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a realization that the hope she had been nursing in secret was finally, definitively dead. She felt a profound sense of loss, but also, strangely, a kind of peace. The uncertainty was over. The truth was fixed. Marianne reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "I am so sorry, Elinor, truly. If anyone deserved a better ending than this, it was you." "Character is its own ending, Marianne," Elinor said, her voice a miracle of composure. "Edward is a man of honor. He made a promise and he kept it. I cannot begrudge him the very quality I most admired in him." But the world had one more surprise in store for them. A few days later, a visitor arrived at the cottage. A man on horseback, his uniform dusty from the road as if he had ridden a great distance in a very short time. It was Edward. He looked different than he had at Cleveland. The shadow in his eyes was gone, replaced by a light that was both cautious and incandescent. He did not look like a man who had just married an heiress or a woman he didn't love. He looked like a man who had suddenly, miraculously, been set free. Elinor met him at the door, her heart doing a frantic, fluttering dance she could no longer control. "Mr. Ferrars, we heard the news." Edward paused, his hat in his hand. "The news that you were married to Miss Steele." A strange, almost comical look of confusion crossed Edward's face. "Married to Lucy, then?" "It is not true." Elinor felt a sudden, dizzying surge of hope. "Oh, it's true enough," Edward said, a slow, wonderful smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Ferrars is indeed married to Lucy Steele. But it is not this Mr. Ferrars, Elinor. Then who?" "My brother, Robert." Elinor felt the world tilt. "Robert, but how?" Edward stepped into the parlor, the warmth of the room reflecting in his eyes. He explained the reality of what had happened. Lucy Steele, realizing that Edward's mother had no intention of relenting on the inheritance, and having met Robert in London, had pivoted her calculations. She had seen in Robert a man of greater vanity and a more accessible fortune. And Robert, in a fit of pride and foolishness, had allowed himself to be won. They had eloped, leaving the Ferrars family in an uproar and Edward in a state of absolute, glorious liberation. "She released me, Elinor," Edward whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "She chose Robert, and in doing so, she gave me back my life. She gave me back my future." He took Elinor's hands then, his grip firm and warm. "I have no fortune now. My mother has indeed cut me off, and Robert will inherit everything. I am a man with nothing but a small living in a quiet parish, and the heart I have always wanted to give to you. I have nothing to offer you but myself, and a life that will be simple and quiet and entirely yours, if you will have me." Elinor did not need to consult her sense. She did not need to weigh the options or consider the consequences. Her sensibility, so long repressed and protected, finally rose up and took its rightful place. "I will have you, Edward," she said, her voice finally breaking into a sob of pure, unadulterated joy. "I will have you forever." The scene that followed was one of absolute, radiant happiness. Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne entered the room, and when the news was shared, the cottage was filled with a laughter and a light that hadn't been there since they left Norland. It was a victory of the spirit over the calculated, a triumph of the heart over the ledger. In the days that followed, the full resolution of their lives began to take shape. Edward obtained the living at Delaford, the parish on Colonel Brandon's estate. It was a small, beautiful stone church with a modest parsonage, surrounded by orchards and the quiet peace of the countryside. It was exactly the life Edward had dreamed of, and exactly the life Elinor was built for. Marianne watched her sister's happiness with a profound, quiet satisfaction. Her own recovery continued, but it was now fueled by something more than just time. It was fueled by the realization that life, in all its messy complexity, could still hold beauty. "It is a strange world, is it not, Elinor?" Marianne said, as they packed the last of Elinor's things for the move to Delaford. "Lucy Steele and Robert Ferrars deserve each other, I suppose. Their marriage will be built on calculation and pride, and they will likely be very successful in the eyes of the ton. And you and Edward. You will have a small house and a quiet life, and you will be the wealthiest people I know." "We will be happy, Marianne," Elinor said, her face glowing with a peace that was deep and unshakable. "And that is the only fortune that truly matters." "And what of me?" Marianne asked, her voice soft. "You will live, Marianne," Elinor said, taking her sister's hand. "You will continue to feel and to love and to play your music. And one day, when the time is right, you will find that the ground beneath your feet is solid again, and you will walk out into the world not as a storm, but as a light. The return to Barton had been a homecoming, but the move to Delaford was a beginning. The Dashwood sisters had walked through the fire, and they had emerged transformed. Sense had taught them how to survive, and sensibility had given them a reason to live. And as they looked out over the valley for the last time, they knew that whatever the future held, they were ready. Because they were no longer just the sensible sister or the passionate sister. They were Elinor and Marianne, and they were finally beautifully home. The wedding of Elinor Dashwood and Edward Ferrars was a quiet, modest affair held in the small stone church at Barton. There was no grand procession, no silk gowns dripping with lace, and no socialites from London to whisper behind their fans. Instead, there was the scent of spring rain on the stone, the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, and the presence of the people who truly loved them. Elinor, in a dress of simple muslin, looked more radiant than she ever had in the grand halls of Norland. The restraint that had defined her for years was now a gentle, settled peace. She stood beside Edward, her hand in his, and as they spoke the vows that had been 4 years in the making, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The promise that Edward had once given to Lucy Steele, a promise that had been a cage, was now replaced by a promise that was a liberation. They settled into the parsonage at Delaford, a house of warm brick and low ceilings, surrounded by an orchard that was white with blossoms. It was a life of simple duties and deep, quiet satisfaction. Edward found his calling in the service of the parish, his natural kindness and integrity finding a perfect outlet in the lives of his congregation. And Elinor found her calling in the creation of a home that was a sanctuary of both sense and sensibility. The relationship between the parsonage and the great house at Delaford became the center of their new world. Colonel Brandon, ever the steady friend, was their most frequent guest. He would arrive in the evenings, his quiet presence a familiar comfort by the fire. He joined them for dinner, for long walks through the woods, and for the music that Elinor now played with a heart that was finally, fully awake. But the most significant transformation was happening within Marianne. Initially, she had been a frequent visitor to Delaford, her presence a whirlwind of energy in the quiet parsonage. She would arrive with news of Barton, with books she wanted to discuss, and with a restless spirit that still seemed to be looking for its own anchor. But as the months turned into a year, the nature of her visits began to change. She spent more time at the great house. She began to take an interest in the Colonel's estate, in the gardens he was reclaiming, the library he was restoring, and the people he was caring for. She saw the man not as a disappointment of her romantic imagination, but as a living testament to the power of a quiet, enduring devotion. "He is so different when you truly know him, Elinor," Marianne said one evening as they sat on the porch of the parsonage, watching the sun set over the valley. "He doesn't speak in poetry, but his every action is a kind of lyric. He doesn't make grand declarations, but his silence is more supportive than any word I have ever heard." Elinor smiled, her heart full of a quiet triumph. "I told you once, Marianne, that age and experience do not rob a man of feeling, they only teach him how to carry it." "I know," Marianne whispered. "I was so young, Elinor. I thought love had to be a storm, a fire that consumed everything in its path. I thought that if it wasn't explosive, it wasn't real. But I see now that the fire that keeps you warm through the winter is the one that is most necessary." The turning point came during the following summer. Marianne, now fully recovered and possessing a new, more grounded kind of beauty, was spending a few weeks at Delaford. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Devonshire. It was news of Willoughby. His marriage to Sophia Grey had become the disaster everyone had predicted. The £50,000 had not been enough to mask the incompatibility of their characters, or to hide the fact that they shared nothing but mutual disdain. Willoughby was a regular in the gambling dens of London, his charm now a brittle, tired thing, while Sophia spent her life in a state of bitter social competition. They were a couple bound together by a transaction that had turned into a prison. Marianne read the news with a strange, cool detachment. "I feel for him," she said to Elinor and the Colonel as they sat in the library. "But I do not envy him. He has exactly what he chose. And he is discovering that a chosen cage is still a cage." Colonel Brandon looked at her then, his eyes full of a respect that was deepening into something more. "You have learned a hard lesson, Miss Marianne, but you have learned it well. I have learned that my own heart is not the only one in the room," Marianne said, her voice steady and clear. "And I have learned that the truest love is the one that sets you free to be yourself, not the one that demands you be someone else." Their engagement followed shortly after. It was not a thunderclap of revelation. It was a quiet, natural progression of a friendship that had been tested and tempered in the fires of their shared past. When the colonel asked for her hand, Marianne did not feel a rush of wild, uncontrollable passion. She felt a deep, profound sense of safety. She felt like a traveler who had finally, after a long and treacherous journey, found the gate to her own garden. They were married at Delaford in a ceremony that was a reflection of their characters, dignified, sincere, and filled with a quiet, powerful joy. Marianne did not wear white. She wore a dress of soft gold, the color of the late afternoon sun. As she stood beside the colonel, she didn't look back at the girl who had run through the rain at Barton. She looked at the woman who was standing in the light of her own choices. The Dashwood sisters were now both settled, their lives intertwined with the men who had proven themselves worthy of their hearts. The parsonage and the great house were the twin poles of a new, balanced world. Elinor and Edward's life continued in its path of quiet service and domestic contentment. They had children who filled the parsonage with laughter and gardens that yielded fruit year after year. Theirs was a love of the earth and the everyday, a sense that had been enriched by the sensibility of their shared joy. Marianne and the colonel's life was one of a different kind of intensity. They traveled, they studied, they made the great house a center of art and intellect and genuine hospitality. Marianne never lost her passion for music or her love of poetry, but she practiced them now with a depth of understanding that was born of her own suffering. Her sensibility was no longer a weapon that she turned on herself or others. It was a lens through which she saw the beauty and the pain of the world with an equal clarity. And what of Willoughby? He remained in the background of their lives, a ghost of a story told by others. Every so often, news would reach them of his latest folly or his wife's latest social triumph. But he no longer had any power over them. He was a situational acquaintance who had served a purpose, however painful, and who was now entirely irrelevant to the substance of their lives. The ultimate lesson of sense and sensibility was not that one should choose one over the other. It was that they were two sides of the same coin. Sense without sensibility was a cold and calculating thing, a merchant's ledger of the soul. Sensibility without sense was a dangerous and hollow thing, a fire that burned the house down to keep the hearth warm. Elinor and Marianne had found the balance. They had learned to feel with their minds and to think with their hearts. They had learned that the truest strength is not in the explosion of the storm, but in the steady, rhythmic persistence of the tide. As they sat together on the terrace of the great house on the final evening of our story, the valley of Delaford spread out before them in the soft light of twilight. The air was still, the only sound the distant call of a nightingale and the quiet murmur of the wind in the trees. "We are very fortunate, are we not, Elinor?" Marianne said, her hand resting on the colonel's arm as he stood beside her. "We are more than fortunate, Marianne," Elinor replied, her hand in Edward's. "We are settled." In the world of Jane Austen, to be settled was more than just a matter of fortune or status. It was a state of the soul. It was to have found your place in the pattern, to have honored your promises, and to have reconciled your feelings with your duties. The Dashwood sisters were settled, and as the darkness finally began to fall, painting the world in shades of indigo and silver, they were no longer afraid of the shadows. Because they were the ones who had found the light, not by avoiding the winter, but by walking through it together. The story was over. The journey was finished. And for Elinor and Marianne, the music was finally, beautifully in tune. The story of Elinor and Marianne Dashwood, as imagined by Jane Austen, is a narrative that has transcended the bounds of its own century. It is a story that speaks to the fundamental tensions of the human experience, the struggle to balance what we feel with what we know, and the challenge of finding our place in a world that often prioritizes the external over the internal. In the quiet, settled lives they found at Delaford, we see not just a resolution of a plot, but a celebration of the resilience of the human spirit. As we linger in the twilight of their story, it is worth reflecting on the journey that brought them here. It began with a loss, the death of a father, and the displacement from a home. It was a journey through the harsh realities of fortune and the even harsher realities of a society that traded in hearts as if they were currency. It was a journey of two sisters, each of whom believed that her own way of responding to the world was the only true way, and who had to learn, through pain and time, that they were both right and both wrong. Elinor's sense was her armor. It was the way she navigated a world that she knew was precarious and often unkind. Her restraint was not a lack of feeling, but a profound expression of it. She felt the weight of her family's survival, the sting of Edward's silence, and the agony of Lucy Steele's revelation with a depth that would have destroyed her if she had not possessed the discipline to hold it. Her journey was one of staying still in the storm, of choosing the quiet path of duty even when it felt like a cage. Her reward was not just a marriage to the man she loved, but the discovery that her strength was not a burden, but a source of life for everyone around her. Marianne's sensibility was her fire. It was the way she experienced the world, not as a series of events, but as a symphony of feelings. Her passion was her greatest gift and her most dangerous weakness. She lived with an intensity that made the world more beautiful for those who saw it through her eyes, but it also made the world more terrifying when the fire went out. Her journey was one of falling into the abyss and being pulled back by the very people she had dismissed as cold or unfeeling. Her reward was not just a marriage to a man who truly understood her, but the discovery that her fire didn't have to consume her to be real. It could be harnessed to warm a home, to nurture an estate, and to see the world with a clarity that only suffering can bring. The resolution of the Ferrars and Steele saga remains one of the most satisfyingly ironic moments in literature. Robert and Lucy, bound together by their own vanity and calculation, are a perfect foil for the genuine connections of the Dashwood sisters. They achieved exactly what they wanted, fortune and status, and in doing so, they revealed the emptiness of those goals when they are pursued at the cost of honor. They are the shadows against which the light of Elinor and Edward's simple life shines all the more brightly. Edward Ferrars himself is a hero of a particular kind, the hero of the quiet and the honest. He was a man who was almost destroyed by his own integrity, who was willing to sacrifice his happiness for a promise made in his youth. His liberation was not a result of his own action, but a result of his character's persistence. He was the man who stayed true to himself when it was hardest, and our joy in his resolution is a joy in the triumph of the decent over the opportunistic. And then there is Colonel Brandon. He remains one of Austen's most underrated creations, a man of profound depth who was hidden behind a mask of melancholy and age. He was the one who didn't compete for Marianne's attention, but who stood in the shadows and protected her from the worst of the fallout. He was the one who didn't quote poetry, but whose life was a poem of service and redemption. His marriage to Marianne is not a consolation prize. It is a union of two souls who had both walked through the winter and who were ready for the spring. As we look back on the hills of Devonshire and the orchards of de Lafford, we are reminded that the questions Jane Austen asked 2 centuries ago are the same questions we ask today. How do we stay true to ourselves while fulfilling our obligations to others? How do we find hope when the world seems determined to take it from us? And how do we learn to love in a way that is both passionate and sustainable? The answers are found in the rhythmic, persistent effort of the everyday. They are found in the stitching of a shirt, the reading of a book, the walking of a garden path, and the quiet, steady loyalty of a sister. They are found in the realization that we are not the centers of our own universes, but parts of a larger, more complex pattern. In the world of sense and sensibility, the ending is not just a happily ever after. It is a meaningfully ever after. It is a state of being settled, not just in a house or a marriage, but in oneself. It is a peace that comes from the reconciliation of our feelings with our realities. As the embers of this story fade and the pages are finally closed, we take with us the memory of the Dashwood sisters. We take with us Elinor's grace and Marianne's fire. We take with us the lessons of the rain at Barton and the crisis at Cleveland. And we take with us the quiet, profound assurance that even in a world of situational acquaintances and calculated transactions, the heart can still find its way home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the world of Jane Austen. We hope that the time spent with the Dashwoods has brought you a sense of peace and a reminder of the quiet courage that lives in all of us. As you move back into your own world, perhaps you can carry a bit of Elinor's sense and a bit of Marianne's sensibility with you. May your own journey be one of balance, and may you find your own place where the music is in tune and the light is always finding its way back. If you enjoyed this episode of Embers and Pages, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this story with someone who might need a bit of quiet distraction. Your support allows us to continue bringing these beautiful classics to life, one page at a time. Until we meet again by the fire, may your nights be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your heart be settled. This has been our exploration of the enduring world of sense and sensibility. And as the darkness finally, fully descends over the landscape of our imagination, we wish you a very quiet and a very good night.